Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere history class never dared to take you, into the bedchambers, salons and shadowy corridors of power where mistresses, not monarchs, quietly pulled the strings of entire kingdoms. This is the story of royal mistresses, those unofficial queens and consorts who turned flirtation into foreign policy and whose influence reshaped dynasties, redirected wars, and occasionally blew up entire governments. Sounds dramatic. It absolutely is. And just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not politically, anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't need fake affection. I'm not Madame de Pompadour. Also, drop your city and what time it is right now in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start in the most logical place, in bed. But not yours. We're slipping into a canopy-draped, velvet-sheeted royal bed, the kind that smells faintly of roses, musk, and betrayal. Picture this. It's the late Middle Ages. Kings are god-ordained and bored. Queens are usually arranged marriages, picked for their dowries or bloodlines. But love? That's outsourced. And who gets the real attention? The mistress. But don't roll your eyes, this wasn't just about sex. Royal mistresses were often the smartest people in the room. They had to be. One wrong word and you're accused of witchcraft or heresy. One missed pregnancy and your power evaporates. But land a king's heart, you could become the shadow empress of Europe. In France, by the 15th century, this unofficial role was gaining official weight. Mistresses weren't just whispered about, they were expected. There was even a term for it, maîtresse en titre, meaning chief mistress, which, let's admit, sounds way better than side piece. These women had residences, titles, salaries, and sometimes diplomatic responsibilities. They weren't hiding, they were courtiers in full regalia, gliding past jealous nobles and stone-faced queens with the confidence of someone who knows she can get a royal pardon if she trips someone. The earliest mistresses weren't exactly official, but they left impact trails behind them. One standout is Alice Perez, mistress to England's Edward III in the 14th century. She was a commoner, probably a lady-in-waiting originally, and somehow managed to snag the attention of an aging king. While the country suffered under plague and political unrest, Alice was out here amassing lands, jewels and enemies. Parliament actually passed laws aimed directly at stopping her influence. Imagine being so good at being hated that the government drafts legislation about you. Queen energy, but here's the kicker. People hated these women not because they were immoral, but because they had power they weren't supposed to have. It was the unearned access that rankled the nobles. Not the romance. I mean, kings could have mistresses, sure, but once those mistresses started sitting in on cabinet meetings or swaying tax decisions, suddenly we've got a problem. Especially if you're a duke who's been waiting 10 years for a promotion, and suddenly that actress from the theatre gets her cousin made a bishop. And speaking of power struggles, let's not pretend the queens were helpless bystanders. Some queens plotted to get rid of their rivals, others tried to work around them, and a few, like Catherine de' Medici, just sort of sighed and handed over the keys to the king's heart, figuring if you can't beat 'em, outlive 'em. Now here's a fringe little nugget. In medieval Spain, mistresses weren't always just women. Some kings had male favourites. Oh yes, courtly companions who blurred the lines between friendship, counsel and possibly more. Alfonso XI of Castile had multiple mistresses, but was said to be oddly attached to a male courtier, who mysteriously rose in rank. Historians argue over the details, of course, but royal beds were a lot less heteronormative than most history books make them out to be. Which brings us to one of the more delicious scholarly debates still circling like gossip at a Versailles masquerade. Were these mistresses truly politically powerful, or were they merely decorative distractions while ministers and councils did the real work? Some argue their influence has been overblown, romanticised by later historians looking for scandal. Others say the opposite, that these women have been dismissed unfairly, their political acumen buried under layers of sexist pearl-clutching. The truth? Probably both. Mistresses came in all flavours, schemers, saints, seductresses, and some who just wanted a pension and a pretty necklace. But what they all had in common was risk. If you were a royal mistress, your position was precarious. You could be adored one week, exiled the next. You could rise from a maid to a duchess or be poisoned at breakfast. No formal job title, no HR protection, just vibes and survival instincts. So why did they do it? Sometimes it was love, or something like it. Sometimes it was ambition. But often it was the only way a woman in a rigid patriarchal society could wield real power. Behind every great king, there was a woman whispering something very smart or very dangerous into his ear. So tonight, you're not just watching a documentary, you're stepping into silk slippers, brushing off powdered wigs, and navigating the most glittering and cutthroat world history has to offer. The royal court, where your charm is your currency, your reputation is your weapon, and your future is always one flirtation or one scandal away from collapsing, and with that the curtains part. Our first act begins in France, where the original official mistress breaks the mould, and possibly the king's brain. You're standing in the glittering court of 15th century France, and everything smells like beeswax, crushed herbs and ambition. The walls are draped in tapestries, the stone floors echo under slippered feet, and every noble eye is watching the same woman glide across the room. Her name is Agnes Sorel, and whether they adore her or despise her, no one can look away. Why? Because she's not just beautiful, she's dangerous. Welcome to the era of Charles VII, a king who came to power during the tail end of the 100 Years' War, looking more like a ragged warlord than a ruler. France was fractured, his court disorganized, and his mental health shaky at best. Enter Agnes, young, clever, and ambitious, with the kind of icy poise that could make even the most hardened knight drop his sword and stare. She wasn't a princess or a duchess or anyone of political consequence, really, but she was about to rewrite the rules. You first spot her not in a coronation scene or on a battlefield, but in a small corner of the royal household, dressed in the latest Italian silks, with a neckline that makes the older courtiers choke on their wine. You'd think it was an accident, but no. Agnes knew exactly what she was doing. She was the first woman in the French court to publicly bare her chest in portraiture, like just one breast elegantly flopped out like it was no big deal. The court whispered, gasped, and copied her within weeks. Suddenly every noble lady wanted to look like Agnes. Every man wanted to be seen with her. And the king, he was completely enthralled. And here's the twist. She wasn't just some pretty distraction. Agnes had opinions. She advised Charles VII on policy. She supported his military campaigns. She pushed for the removal of corrupt courtiers and helped bolster his crumbling confidence after years of humiliation at the hands of the English and his own scheming relatives. Before Agnes, Charles was a broken man. After Agnes, he was crowned at Rheims, thanks in part to a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, and a mistress who knew how to turn admiration into momentum. The line between mistress and political operator had officially blurred. Now here's your historical fact of the night. Agnes Sorel was the first woman in France to hold the official title of maîtresse en titre. Before her, mistresses were background characters, quiet lovers never formally acknowledged. Agnes changed that. She was given estates, titles, jewellery, and even bodyguards. She wasn't hidden in some dusty tower, she was paraded. The court seethed, but they obeyed. The clergy protested, but the king didn't care. And for a while Agnes ruled France from her silk-draped rooms with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a few well-timed whispers. Of course, not everyone clapped. The church wasn't thrilled. Having an official mistress flaunt herself around court, especially one who occasionally wore dresses that imitated the Virgin Mary, was a little much, even by 15th century standards. But Charles protected her like she was made of porcelain and political leverage. That protection lasted until it didn't. In 1450, while heavily pregnant with her fourth child, Agnes suddenly became ill. At first, it seemed like food poisoning, stomach cramps, fatigue. But she died shortly afterward, and you don't have to be a medieval detective to raise an eyebrow. Rumours flew, poison, murder, revenge, political assassination. One suspect, the king's own son, the future Louis XI, a famously ruthless man with a deep hatred for his father's inner circle. Another suspect, well, pretty much from anyone at court who'd been humiliated or sidelined by her rise. So half the population. For centuries her death was one of those murky mysteries historians whispered about. Then in 2005, yes, 500 years later, her remains were exhumed and tested. What did they find? Mercury, a lot of it. Enough to suggest she was either poisoned or treated very, very poorly for an illness. Was it medicine or murder? That's where historians still bicker. Some argue mercury was used to treat parasites or postpartum infections. Others say, no way, this was a hit job disguised as a fever. Whatever the truth, her death sent a message. Rise too high, burn too bright, and you're playing with fire. And here's where things get weirdly fringe. After her death, people said she started appearing in dreams, not just to Charles, but to mystic soldiers and even Joan of Arc fanatics. Agnes became part of a strange folklore, the sexy saint, the lost mother of France, the protector spirit of a broken king. Her image was etched into talismans. Her name was invoked during childbirth. Somewhere between scandal and sainthood, she slipped into legend. But even legends can't escape politics. After her death, Charles VII married her cousin, not out of love, out of convenience. The new woman never had the same glow, the same gravitational pull. The court tried to erase Agnes's impact, but it couldn't. Her fingerprints were all over royal policy. Her protégés remained powerful. Her enemies stayed afraid. Even her wardrobe continued to inspire fashion trends years after her death. Here's the thing no one likes to admit. Sometimes a woman changes history not with a sword or a crown or a birthright, but with style, nerve, and a well-placed smirk. Agnes Sorel wasn't a general. She wasn't a noble by birth. But she was brilliant at being exactly what her king needed, at a time when France desperately needed someone, anyone, to hold him together. So tonight, as you fluff your pillow and get cozy under those covers, remember this. Sometimes the future of a nation rests not in a war room, but in a candlelit chamber, where one sharp-eyed woman whispers, "You could be great again." Next up, a woman who didn't settle for being the king's mistress. She wanted the whole damn crown, and got it, briefly. You're walking through the grand halls of Tudor England now, where the torches flicker low and the walls are thick with whispers. The ceilings are so high they vanish into darkness, and every footstep echoes like a judgment. Because this is a place where ambition isn't just dangerous, it's lethal. Tonight, you're going to brush up against the silk skirts and steel nerves of a woman who didn't just become a royal mistress, she played the long game. And she won, sort of. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and she changed the fate of an entire kingdom. But don't get too comfortable. This one ends with a sword, so let's set the scene. England, early 1500s. King Henry VIII is trapped in a political and religious no-man's land. He's been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years, but the marriage isn't giving him what he really wants, a living male heir. Enter Anne Boleyn, clever, magnetic, fashion-forward, and absolutely not here for casual flirting. Unlike the standard royal mistress, Anne wasn't just aiming for influence. She wanted the ring, the crown, the whole blasted monarchy. And the shocking part? She got it. Anne was different from the typical courtly mistress. First of all, she refused to sleep with the king. That's right, refused. For 7 years, Henry chased her like a teenage boy with a lute, while Anne kept saying, "No ring, no kingdom, no me." And that was revolutionary. Because while mistresses before her had used beauty to climb the ladder, Anne used wrestling. She turned seduction into a chess match. And Henry, he was obsessed. Now here's a juicy historical fact for you. Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church just to marry her. That's right. He split England from Rome, invented the Church of England, and launched a religious transformation that would ripple across Europe for centuries. All because Anne wouldn't give him the time of day until she got a title. That's either a love story or a cautionary tale about hormonal monarchs, depending on your mood. But here's where it gets slippery. Anne wasn't loved by everyone. The common people whispered that she was a witch. Nobles accused her of being too political, too proud. Even Queen Catherine's supporters, who still saw her as the rightful queen, despised Anne. She was called the concubine, the great whore, and the goggle-eyed harlot. The court turned into a minefield, with Anne dancing through it like a woman who didn't quite realise the ground was about to crack beneath her heels. And oh, did she dance! Anne didn't just accept the title of queen, she remade it in her image. She brought French fashions to court, supported humanist scholars, and was famously opinionated in political affairs. She clashed with Thomas Cromwell, tried to influence foreign policy, and wasn't shy about criticising her husband, the king, mind you, when she disagreed with his choices. The idea of a queen being silent and obedient? That ship had sailed. Anne had opinions, and she wasn't afraid to air them. Loudly. So now you're thinking, well, good for her. Right? Strong woman, clever, fearless, but this is Tudor England. Strong women don't get applause, they get trials. And here's the historical debate. Was Anne Boleyn framed? because just 3 years after she finally got that crown on her head, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Yes, incest with her own brother. Totally casual stuff, obviously. The evidence was paper thin. Her accusers, men with everything to gain from her downfall, and her biggest mistake, she'd stopped being the king's obsession. Anne had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth. And had several miscarriages after. Henry, never exactly known for his patience, started eyeing her ladies-in-waiting. History may say she was executed for adultery, but the real charge was probably this. She'd lost her usefulness. Let's pause here for a moment and slide in a quirky little fact. Anne Boleyn may have had 6 fingers on one hand, at least that's what the gossip said. It might have been an extra nail or a small deformity, but in the era of witch hunting and superstition, that was enough to brand her as unnatural. Her enemies called her the devil's consort. The truth, probably less dramatic, but the story stuck because nothing fuels a smear campaign like a dash of sorcery. And when her time came, Anne didn't beg. She walked to the scaffold in a plain grey dress, composed and eerily calm, no wild weeping, no shrieking. She addressed the crowd with a small gracious speech, no mention of innocence or injustice, just a prayer for the king's health and the country's future. Then she knelt, tucked her chibot, and waited for a French swordsman, specially imported to make it clean to end her reign. One clean stroke, no screams, just silence. That moment, that single swing, did more than kill a queen. It left behind a daughter who would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs in British history, Elizabeth I, and whether Anne knew it or not. Her legacy wouldn't be in the marriage she won or the king she lost. It would be in the fire she passed on to her daughter. A queen raised in the shadow of scandal who learned to navigate power without ever marrying anyone at all. A woman who ruled alone. The scholarly bickering around Anne Boleyn's true influence never ends. Was she a pawn or a power player? Was she a victim of a ruthless king or an ambitious woman who gambled too hard? The truth, as always, is a royal mess, probably some of both. She was loved, hated, and feared, often at the same time. She helped create a new church, ended a 20-year marriage, and became the first English queen to be executed. So yeah, she made an impression. Tonight, as you lie there under your blanket, picture the candle-lit hall where Anne once held court. Imagine the sound of her laugh echoing against stone, the rustle of her silk skirts as she turned heads and whispered plans. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous woman in the room isn't the one shouting orders, it's the one who makes kings change religion just to earn her smile. Next, you're heading to France again, where another mistress holds court, but this one doesn't just dabble in influence, she directs the show like a royal producer, from her bath to the battlefield. You're back in France now, but not in the war-torn medieval kingdom you saw before. This time, the Renaissance is in full swing. The scent of blooming gardens clings to the air. Perfumes drift from passing courtiers, and classical art glimmers on walls polished with wealth and power. The French court at Fontainebleau is dripping in beauty and intrigue, and in the middle of it all, wrapped in satin and riding a white horse through the king's personal garden like she owns the place, because she kind of does, is Diane de Poitiers. Let's be clear, you're not supposed to root for her. She's 35 when she becomes mistress to the French king, and he's 15. Yeah, read that again. It's one of the most eyebrow-raising relationships in royal history, but it's also one of the most enduring and politically potent. Because Diane wasn't just some passing fancy, she was the power behind the young King Henry II, and for over 2 decades she wasn't just sleeping with the king, she was running the kingdom. It starts like this. Diane is widowed young, sharp as a blade, and incredibly well read. She understands astrology, philosophy, architecture, and most importantly, how men think. She's poised, gracious, and completely terrifying if you cross her. After her husband dies, she dons black and gold mourning clothes and never takes them off. Not because she's grieving forever, but because it becomes her brand. Diane is the prototype for power widow chic. Mysterious, stylish, slightly untouchable. She wears her reputation like armour. Now, here's your historical fact. Diane de Poitiers essentially served as co-ruler of France without ever holding a title. She had her own political network, wrote letters in the king's name, and even reviewed royal decrees before they went out. Her symbol, a crescent moon, was carved into buildings alongside the king's own monogram. Imagine walking through the royal gardens and seeing her initials entwined with his, like they were married. It wasn't subtle, and Diane, she was not subtle. She bathed daily in cold water and white wine, insisted on rigorous horseback riding to keep her figure, and maintained flawless skin well into her 60s, no easy feat in an era where lead-based makeup was practically required. She commissioned stunning fountains and palaces, including the Château de Chenonceau, which the king gave to her over his own wife, Queen Catherine de' Medici. That went over super well. Now, about Catherine. Yes, we need to talk about her. Because imagine being the Queen of France, married to the king, birthing 10 children and still being sidelined for a woman 20 years older than your husband. That's the rage Catherine lived with every day. She couldn't confront Diane directly. Diane was too beloved, too untouchable. But she watched, learned, and waited. Oh, did she wait? But back to Diane. She wasn't just guiding policy from a velvet armchair. She had opinions on war. She urged Henry to support certain alliances, dissuaded him from trusting some nobles, and even shaped the aesthetics of the royal court. She preferred Roman antiquity themes, so suddenly everything was marble columns and gold laurel crowns. If Diane said peacock feathers were in, everyone else threw theirs away. It wasn't just influence, it was domination. And here comes your quirky fringe fact of the night. Diane drank gold literally. She believed that consuming small amounts of gold dissolved in liquid would preserve her youth. Yeah, she basically sipped on precious metals like a medieval Gwyneth Paltrow. The irony? When her remains were exhumed centuries later, they found her bones contained abnormally high levels of gold. Whether it worked or not depends on your standards. She looked great, but she died at 66, which wasn't bad for the 16th century, but definitely didn't make her immortal. But even golden mistresses have to die, metaphorically, when the king does. In 1559, Henry II dies suddenly in a jousting accident. Yes, a freak splinter to the eye, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. And Diane's world collapses overnight. Catherine de' Medici wastes zero time. She strips Diane of her properties, demands the return of Château de Chenonceau, and banishes her from court. The Queen finally had her moment, and she made sure Diane felt every ounce of it. And here's where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Was Diane de Poitiers a stabilising force in France, or did she weaken the monarchy by entrenching favouritism? Some historians see her as a wise, capable figure who kept Henry focused and the court functional. Others argue that her control fueled resentment, political stagnation, and empowered the kind of personal loyalty that undercuts institutions. Both views have their merits. What's clear is that Diane de Poitiers didn't just influence the crown. She was the crown, at least in how it moved, glittered, and made decisions. As her power faded, Diane retired quietly, returning to her estate at Anet. No rebellion, no memoir, just silence and statuary. She left behind one of the most visually striking courts in French history, her crescent moon motif echoing in the gardens and walls she helped design. Her enemies painted her as a calculating seductress, a political manipulator who bedazzled a boy king and sidelined a nation's queen. Her defenders? They saw her as a Renaissance woman par excellence, one of the most brilliant, capable courtiers France ever knew. Tonight, as you pull your covers up a little tighter, imagine riding through the misty woods of 16th century France, trailing behind a veiled figure in black and gold, the moonlight catching on her silver hair, her eyes sharper than thin blade. She doesn't need a title. She is the throne, at least until someone takes it from her. A woman who might have actually worn the crown, if only fate and a few too many enemies hadn't stepped in. You find yourself in Paris at the tail end of the 16th century, and everything feels tense, like the air itself is holding its breath. The cobblestones are slick with rain, and the alleys echo with the clatter of gossip. France is staggering through wars of religion, Protestant versus Catholic, nobles versus monarchs, and at the centre of this exhausting mess, a woman lounging in silks, her hand idly tracing the rim of a wineglass while the kingdom teeters. Her name is Gabrielle d'Estrées, and she's not just another royal mistress. She is, briefly, powerfully, and fatally, almost a queen. Picture this: Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France, newly crowned, but not yet solid in his power. The kingdom is a mess, years of civil war, regional uprisings, and a deeply divided population. Henry needs unity, he needs credibility, and most of all he needs a Catholic queen. Unfortunately for him, he's in love with Gabrielle, a noble woman who checks none of the expected boxes. She's not royal, she's not married, well, not anymore, and she's definitely not universally adored. But Henry, he is completely undone by her. Now here's your historical fact for the night. Gabrielle d'Estrées wielded more power than any mistress in French history up to that point. Henry IV referred to her as his true wife, included her in political discussions, and signed state documents as Henri and Gabrielle, as if they were co-rulers. Just soak that in, a mistress being named on official paperwork. That's not romance, that's power, and she used it. Gabrielle advised the king on how to navigate the thorny religious politics of the time, encouraging his famous decision to convert to Catholicism in 1593. You've probably heard the quote, "Paris is worth a mass." That moment, that wasn't just strategy, it was the exact kind of maneuver Gabrielle was pushing for. She knew that to rule effectively, Henry needed to bridge the divide. She wasn't just thinking about their love, she was thinking about the nation. But of course, not everyone was thrilled about this. The nobles, many of whom were Catholic hardliners, couldn't stomach the idea of a former Protestant mistress becoming queen. The Pope was barely willing to accept Henry himself, let alone Gabrielle. The women of the court whispered, mocked her, spread rumours. One wrote that she had the face of a Madonna and the heart of a harlot, which, to be honest, sounds like a fantastic business card. So what made Gabrielle so threatening? For one, she was stunning. Her famous portrait, yes, the one where she's sitting in a bath and her sister's casually pinching her nipple, Google it when you're not in bed, became an icon of sensuality and scandal. But more than that, she was smart. Calculating, yes, but not cold. She balanced her ambition with affection, and Henry trusted her judgment as much as he craved her presence. That mix? Unforgivable in a court where most mistresses were expected to smile, nod, and stay out of strategy. By 1599. Henry had decided. He was going to marry Gabrielle. He even got the annulment from his first marriage. Wedding plans were underway. The court was frothing at the mouth. Gabrielle, now heavily pregnant with their fourth child, received a golden coronet, a literal symbol of queenship. She was inches from the crown, and then she died, suddenly, violently, at age 26. She collapsed in pain while dining at the home of a court official and died soon after, suffering convulsions and vomiting. The diagnosis at the time was eclampsia, complications from pregnancy, but even then, people weren't buying it. Rumours of poisoning spread like wildfire. After all, her death came at exactly the moment when her queenship seemed inevitable. The timing was just a little too perfect. One noble reportedly toasted her death, saying, "Now France is saved." And here comes the scholarly debate. Was Gabrielle d'Estrées murdered to stop her from becoming queen? There's no solid evidence, no signed confession. But considering the political stakes, the number of enemies she had, and the nature of her symptoms, let's just say it wouldn't be the first time a royal mistress mysteriously died, right before achieving ultimate power. Modern historians go back and forth. Was it childbirth related, a stroke, or was someone slipping something into her wine glass while pretending to be her friend? Here's a bizarre little side note for your sleepy brain. Gabrielle's heart was embalmed separately and placed in a gold box in the Abbey of Montespan. Yes, just her heart. It stayed there for centuries, guarded like a relic. Why? Because Henry loved her so deeply he couldn't bear to bury her whole body. When he heard she had died, he reportedly wept uncontrollably and locked himself in his chambers. This from a man who once said he loved war more than women. That should tell you everything. After Gabrielle's death, Henry married someone else, Marie de Medici, a politically safe choice with a massive dowry. He did what kings do, moved on for the sake of the realm, but he never gave another woman the kind of influence Gabrielle had. She remained the great what-if of his reign. What if she had lived? What kind of queen would she have been? Would the Bourbon dynasty have looked different? Would France have seen its first unofficial co-ruler centuries before it ever entertained the idea of a female monarch? We'll never know, but tonight, as you sink deeper into your blanket, imagine Gabrielle standing in the shadows of Notre Dame, dressed in royal silks, fingers brushing the crown she would never wear, a heartbeat away from history, a love story rewritten as a cautionary tale. She was almost queen, but in France almost is the most dangerous place to be. Next, the party kicks off in Restoration England, where mistresses weren't just lovers, they were celebrities and sometimes spies. You're stepping out of the shadowy halls of French ambition and into something altogether looser, louder and soaked in wine. Restoration England. The year is 1660, Puritan rule has collapsed, Cromwell is dead, and the monarchy has come crawling back in with wigs, ruffles, and a level of horniness not seen since the days of the Roman Empire. King Charles II is back on the throne, and he's making up for lost time, big time. Gone are the days of sombre court protocol and moral policing. Now it's all poetry, theatre, and beds that barely cool between visitors, and at the centre of this royal soap opera, a rotating cast of mistresses who define the entire tone of the era. You're in London, walking through Whitehall Palace. There's music drifting from some distant chamber, and somewhere nearby someone is laughing too loudly. The court is packed, not with the pious or powerful, but with poets, dancers, gamblers, and a healthy mix of pickpockets and nobles dressed like actors. Because Charles II doesn't care what you are, as long as you're entertaining, and his mistresses? They are the entertainment. Let's not pretend these were just trysts. These women were power brokers, celebrity influencers, sometimes shown spies, and always being watched. They wielded influence not because they came from noble stock, but because they knew how to keep the king's attention, and turn that attention into power, property, and prestige. The Merry Gang, as you'll come to know them, were practically co-rulers in their own right. So tonight, you're getting to know a few of them, not just as mistresses, but as the women who redefined what it meant to hold court from the king's bed. Let's start with a name that still sparkles. Barbara Palmer, later made the Countess of Castlemaine. She was wild, willful, and, depending on who you ask, completely deranged. And Charles, he was obsessed. She gave birth to 5 of his children and screamed at him in public, like full-on shouting matches in the corridors of court. She had other lovers, got into brawls with ladies-in-waiting, and, allegedly, once beat a rival with a hairbrush. Barbara didn't play court politics the quiet way. She played loud and she played dirty, but somehow she always landed on her feet. And here's your historical fact. Charles II had at least 13 known mistresses and fathered more than a dozen illegitimate children, but not one legitimate heir. That right there is the Restoration in a nutshell. Chaotic, indulgent, and deeply unstable beneath the glitter. The king's refusal to marry someone who could give him a legitimate Protestant heir nearly threw the monarchy into crisis. But did he care? Barely at all. He was too busy funding the theatre, sneaking off to masked balls and charming the population with his easy wit and full head of luscious, well-maintained hair. Barbara wasn't alone, of course. There was also Louise de Kérouaille, the elegant French mistress who played the long game. While Barbara brawled, Louise plotted. She was a calculated import from the court of Louis XIV sent to charm Charles, and maybe spy for France. She did both with a velvet smile. People hated her. She was Catholic, foreigner, and polished to the point of perfection. But Charles adored her. She received jewels, estates and titles, becoming the Duchess of Portsmouth and holding court like a queen in everything but name. Now here's your fringe fact. Louise had a custom-made bed with a secret drawer underneath, to hide letters she smuggled for the French crown. That's not confirmed, obviously, but come on. This is Restoration England. You've got actresses sneaking into court in disguise, courtiers duelling over love notes, and one mistress literally falling out of favour because she farted during a dance. Looking at you, Hortense Mancini. A hidden spy drawer is downright reasonable. But the real power of these women wasn't espionage, it was visibility. They weren't just in the king's bed, they were in his court. They received ambassadors. They were painted by court artists, praised in poetry, and sometimes even appealed to by desperate politicians hoping to bend the king's ear. Charles wasn't a particularly decisive ruler, and many ministers knew that getting their policy through might require an offhand whisper to Lady Castlemaine, or a flattering gift to the Duchess of Portsmouth. And here's the scholarly debate that still gets tossed around like a goblet of cheap claret. Were Charles's mistresses simply distractions, or were they essential political actors in a dysfunctional system? Some say they undermined the state with frivolity and favouritism. Others argue they acted as informal diplomats, stabilising the king's moods and smoothing over tensions in a court constantly on the edge of scandal. The answer, like everything in this era, is complicated. They were both charming chaos agents and, in some cases, the grease that kept the royal wheels turning. Let's not forget that Charles's court was the original media circus. The newly relaxed censorship laws meant gossip pamphlets, woodcut prints, and political cartoons exploded. Everyone wanted the dirt, and the mistresses, they were the main characters. Barbara was portrayed as a she-devil. Louise was drawn as a snake in a velvet gown. Their fashion choices were copied, mocked, and then copied again. They were torn apart in satire and worshipped in style. If you think reality TV invented the concept of love triangles and revenge arcs, think again. Tonight, as you lie back and drift off, picture a candlelit salon somewhere inside Whitehall. The king's voice drifts through the corridors, witty, charming, slightly drunk. A woman in a sapphire blue gown glides across the floor, every eye turning toward her. She isn't royal by birth, she doesn't wear a crown, but her influence, oh, it's as heavy as gold. She knows every rumour, every alliance, and exactly how far a well-timed smile can stretch. Restoration England didn't run on ministers and monarchs. It ran on actresses, adventuresses, and mistresses who knew that power was never about titles, it was about proximity. And they were always so close. Next, you'll walk beside the most beloved of Charles's lovers, a former orange seller who stole the king's heart and the country's affection without ever losing her sense of humour. You're standing at the edge of a raucous London theatre, the kind where the laughter is loud, the gossip even louder, and someone just spilled mead on your shoes. Welcome to Drury Lane, mid-1660s, where the restoration is in full swing and the stage is more than entertainment. It's a launchpad for social climbing, scandal and stardom. Tonight, all eyes are on a woman darting through the crowd, arms full of oranges and attitude. She's cracking jokes, maybe slipping a few into gentlemen's pockets, maybe slipping a note into their hands. She's fast, funny and completely unbothered by the rigid social rules around her. You'll know her name soon. Nell Gwynn, the mistress who went from fruit seller to national treasure, and made the British monarchy just a little bit more likeable. Let's start at the bottom, because that's exactly where Nell came from. She was born in 1650 in Covent Garden, back when it was more grit than glamour. Her mother ran a brothel, her father vanished early, and Nell grew up learning how to get by with charm, wit, and the uncanny ability to make people listen. As a child, she worked in a tavern, then later sold oranges at the King's Theatre. Not exactly a resume for royalty, but Nell had something most courtiers lacked. She was real, and soon she was on stage. Nell became one of England's first professional actresses, at a time when women were just beginning to be allowed on stage. Her comic timing was impeccable, her smile disarming, and she made the audience feel like she was in on the joke with them, which, let's be honest, she absolutely was. She starred in bawdy comedies, often playing clever servant girls or scheming mistresses. Typecasting? Maybe, but Nell turned those roles into masterclasses in charm and irreverence. Now here's your historical fact. Nell Gwynn was the most beloved of Charles VII's many mistresses by the people. She wasn't noble, she wasn't foreign, she didn't scheme, she didn't even try to be respectable, and somehow that made her unforgettable. While other royal mistresses were being accused of espionage or religious manipulation, Nell was cracking jokes about Catholic priests and calling out Charles's other mistresses in public. Once, her coach was mistaken for that of the king's Catholic mistress, Louise de Kérouaille. When the angry crowd started shouting insults, Nell stuck her head out the window and yelled, "Pray, good people, be civil! I am the Protestant whore!" The crowd roared with laughter and let her pass. Louise would never. And that brings us to a fringe little fact. Nell Gwynn is believed to be one of the first celebrities to use what we'd now call PR strategy. She didn't just let people love her. She gave them reasons to. She poked fun at herself. She never apologised for her past. She leaned into the absurdity of being a poor actress turned royal mistress. And it worked. She became England's sweetheart, not because she was perfect, but because she was transparent. People didn't just admire Nell, they rooted for her. Charles II was no fool. He liked mistresses for many reasons, but with Nell, he got more than beauty. He got loyalty, humour, and a break from the exhausting pretense of court life. Their relationship lasted for nearly 2 decades. She bore him 2 sons, one of whom, Charles Beauclerk, was later made the Duke of St. Albans. Not bad for someone who used to hawk fruit outside a playhouse. Unlike the more political mistresses of the time, Nell never tried to grab at state power. She didn't meddle in foreign affairs or pressure the king for government appointments. Her ambitions were different. She wanted security for her children, a comfortable home, and maybe a title or two, which she got, eventually. It took some pushing. Legend has it that on Charles's deathbed in 1685, one of his last words was, "Let not poor Nellie starve." The new king, James II, grudgingly kept her pension going. She had earned it, after all. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was Nell Gwyn truly apolitical, or did her presence at court shape public perception of the monarchy in a time of massive unrest? England was dealing with anti-Catholic riots, power struggles, and deep fears of foreign influence. Having a witty working-class Protestant as the king's mistress may have been Charles's smartest move. It gave the people a relatable figure to cling to. Some historians argue that Nell helped humanise the monarchy when it most needed it. Others say she was just a pleasant distraction from bigger issues. You can decide which sounds more likely, while lying flat on your pillow and letting that brain quietly spiral, once something even quirkier. After Nell died in 1687, she was buried in a modest grave, but centuries later her name was adopted by a high-class London brothel as a symbol of cheeky English sensuality. Today her image still shows up in pubs, theatre posters, and even British slang. You'll hear someone called a bit of a Nell Gwyn and know exactly what that means. She's become more than a mistress, she's an archetype. The street-smart woman who rises to the top with laughter, not lies. Nell's legacy is everywhere. In how Britain embraced celebrity culture, in how working-class charm still wins hearts, in how we look at royal figures not just as sovereigns, but as personalities, real or imagined. She didn't wield armies or pen treaties, but she altered the emotional tone of an entire reign. While others schemed, she smiled. And that, oddly enough, may have been the smarter move. So tonight, picture Nell curled up on a divan, giggling at some dumb joke Charles just made, one hand feeding grapes to her dog and the other already scribbling a cheeky poem. No jewels, no titles, no drama, just joy. Because sometimes you don't need to rule the kingdom, you just need to make it laugh. Next, you'll slink into the world of spies and secrets, where being a mistress wasn't just about affection, it was about international espionage, whispered passwords, and possibly a crown smuggled across borders. You're moving now from candlelit theatres to shadowed drawing rooms, from laughter to something colder, quieter. It's the late 1670s in Restoration England, but we're not lounging with actresses anymore. Tonight, you're following the soft click of silk heels down echoing corridors lined with secrets, because the next mistress in this royal rogues gallery isn't known for her jokes or her wit, she's known for her whisper. Meet Louise de Kérouaille, Duchess of Portsmouth, King's mistress, yes, but also, maybe, a spy planted by France. Now, let's get something straight. Louise doesn't arrive in England like a whirlwind, the way Nell Gwyn did. She arrives like a perfume, drifting subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but impossible to ignore once it's settled. She's French, Catholic, perfectly manicured, and polite to the point of being unshakable. And the court? Oh, they hate her immediately. She's everything the Restoration England fears. Catholic, foreign and loyal not just to King Charles II, but possibly to his cousin across the channel, Louis XIV. Here's your historical fact. Louise de Kérouaille held the position of royal mistress longer than any other woman during Charles VI's reign, and she became astonishingly rich doing it. The king granted her land, titles, pensions and jewels, not to mention a ducal title, Duchess of Portsmouth, which outraged just about everyone. And the French king? He paid her too, regularly, like she was on payroll, which, well, she might have been. Because Louise didn't just lounge around the palace eating candied almonds and batting her lashes. She was strategic, she had a network, she passed letters, she received letters. There were entire episodes where English courtiers would stumble upon encrypted documents in her possession, and her response was always the same, a tight smile and a new necklace from the king the next day. Now, let's sink into the fringe fact you didn't expect. Louise's bedroom reportedly had a secret tunnel that allowed her to receive private messages without a palace staff seeing. Was it real? Maybe. The details are lost to history, but her apartments were remodelled at one point to include private stairways and hidden passageways. You don't get that kind of architectural favour unless you're doing something a bit more than just entertaining the king. And Charles? He wasn't blind. He knew his court was divided between Team Nell and Team Louise, and he played the sides like a man who enjoyed watching the world swirl around him. Nell Gwyn once referred to Louise as Squintabella, a jab at her slightly off-centred eyes, and Louise countered with jabs about Nell's unpolished manners. It was elegant warfare. Louise didn't need to scream, she just had to wait and outlive, which she did. In fact, when Charles was on his deathbed in 1685, he had only a few parting thoughts. One was to make peace with his brother James. Another was to ensure Nell didn't starve. But Louise? She had already secured her fortune and was quietly preparing her exit. She knew what happened to women like her when the king died, and she wasn't about to end oath like so many discarded courtiers before her. And here's the academic scuffle. Was Louise truly a French spy, or just a convenient target for anti-Catholic paranoia? Some scholars argue that the payments she received from Louis XIV were just gifts, the same way royals passed gold to each other like birthday cards. Others insist her entire tenure at court was a long con to influence Charles's foreign policy in France's favour. The truth, of course, probably lies somewhere in the smoky in-between. Maybe she was passing along sensitive information. Maybe she just looked like she was. In a court ruled by perception, sometimes it doesn't matter what's true, it only matters what they believe. What's undeniable is this. Louise helped shape the king's favour toward France. Treaties, alliances, trade negotiations, all of them skewed toward Louis XIV while she was whispering into Charles's ear. And even though England was deeply suspicious of Catholic influence, Charles never turned her away. If anything, her poise and patience made her one of the most trusted figures in his life. He kept her close, even as the storm clouds of political and religious backlash brewed all around them. After Charles's death, Louise fled England with more gold and diamonds than some entire counties possessed. She retreated to France, where she lived in luxury until her death in 1734, nearly 50 years later. 50. While Nell died just 2 years after Charles, Louise went on to see the rise of new kings, new mistresses, and Bourbon, and new wars, all from the safety of her French estate. She outlived her time, her rivals, and her reputation. History eventually got bored and moved on. But in her heyday, she was terrifyingly effective. Here's the quieter truth. In a world where men wrote the laws, commanded armies, and claimed divine right, women like Louise rewrote the margins, not loudly, not dramatically, but carefully, like a hand gliding across silk, leaving no mark but moving everything beneath it. Tonight, as you drift off, picture a candle-lit chamber deep inside Whitehall. A woman in a silver gown sits by the fire, a quill in hand, her eyes scanning a sealed letter. Behind the walls, whispers echo. Outside, the city fumes with rumours. But here, it's calm, because she's already moved the chess piece. She's already won. Next up, Versailles cracks under the weight of dark magic, poison, and baby bones. And yes, the king's mistress is right in the middle of it all. Tonight, you slip through the golden gates of Versailles, slowly, quietly. It's late, the halls are lit with flickering candlelight, and the smell of beeswax and rosewater clings to the air. This is supposed to be the most civilized court in Europe, the cleanest, the most beautiful, but something's wrong. Behind the ornate panels and mirrored walls, you can feel it, a stench of something darker, sulphur, blood, fear. Welcome to the affair of the poisons, where one of the most powerful mistresses in history, Madame de Montespan, was accused of black masses, infant sacrifice, and witchcraft. Sweet dreams, you meet Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, better known as Madame de Montespan in the full bloom of her power. The late 1660s. She's beautiful, charming, effortlessly witty, and already a married noblewoman. But her husband? A detail. The real prize is the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, whose attention she captures with a heady mix of flirtation, opulence, and relentless charisma. The court, predictably, loses its mind. She replaces Louise de la Vallière as the king's chief mistress, a title that comes with real perks, rooms at Versailles, influence over appointments, and enough diamonds to bankrupt a small nation. But Montespan isn't satisfied with just being adored. She wants dominance, she wants to be the woman, and for nearly a decade she is. The Sun King burns for her. They have 7 children together, all of whom are later legitimized. She becomes the Queen's public rival, eclipsing even the actual monarch in popularity and power. Ministers, artists, and nobles court her favour. Poets write about her lips like they're national monuments. She doesn't just attend court, she runs it. Here's your historical fact. During her reign as royal mistress, Madame de Montespan effectively served as an unofficial minister, advising Louis XIV and shaping court life to her taste. The king adored her intellect and her ability to match him thought for thought. She knew court politics, understood foreign alliances, and kept tabs on the dozens of rival factions vying for the king's attention. While the queen embroidered in silence, Montespan was whispering suggestions that made it into policy. But now we shift into the unholy part of the story. Because Versailles wasn't just champagne and chamber music. It was also home to one of the most scandalous criminal investigations in French history. A case involving witches, fortune-tellers, poisoners, and underground black masses that reached straight into the royal bedroom. The affair of the poisons. It started in the late 1670s when police began investigating a network of fortune-tellers and alchemists in Paris. What they found was, yikes. Testimonies spoke of clients paying for love spells, poisons, and demonic rituals. Names spilled out like poison from a broken vial, and one name kept surfacing, Madame de Montespan. According to some reports, Montespan, terrified that she'd lose the king's love, had turned to a known sorceress named La Voisin. Through her, Montespan allegedly attended black masses, yes, literal satanic ceremonies, where she lay naked on an altar, while priests performed dark rituals to bind Louis to her forever. Human sacrifices may have been involved, including, brace yourself, infants. Now, are these rumours credible? Who knows? But the accusations were detailed, relentless, and terrifying. Here's your fringe fact for the night. La Voisin confessed under torture to performing over 200 black masses for high-ranking clients, including royal mistresses. One of her rituals allegedly involved baptizing a stillborn baby, stabbing it, and offering its blood in exchange for favour from the devil. Totally normal 17th century behaviour, obviously. The scandal erupted. Dozens of nobles were implicated. Several were executed. La Voisin herself was burned at the stake in 1680. And Montespan, well, she was never officially charged. The king ordered the investigation sealed the moment her name was mentioned. He couldn't risk exposing the court to that level of shame. But the damage was done. Montespan's star began to fall. And here comes the scholarly debate. Did Montespan really dabble in the occult, or was she the victim of court politics and misogynistic paranoia? Some historians believe the accusations were fabricated by rivals, people jealous of her unprecedented power and influence. Others point to the overwhelming number of testimonies as suspicious, but too numerous to dismiss outright. Still, without concrete evidence, her guilt remains in that ambiguous, deliciously spooky space between historical truth and bedtime horror story. After the scandal, Louis began to drift. He grew more devout, more distant. Montespan, once the golden centre of his world, found herself replaced by a quieter, more pious woman, Madame de Maintenon, who we'll meet soon enough. Montespan stayed at court, but her power eroded. Her laughter grew rarer. She began attending more church services, and eventually she left Versailles for good. She died in 1707, far from the gilded chaos she once ruled. Some say she never truly repented for what she may have done. Others say she was crushed under the weight of guilt, power, and rumour. Either way, her legacy remains one of the most thrillingly dark chapters in the history of royal mistresses. So tonight, as you pull the covers up a little tighter, imagine Versailles. Not the clean, golden version you see on postcards, but the one filled with whispers and flickering shadows. Behind one of those mirrors, maybe someone is watching. Behind a velvet curtain, maybe someone's chanting. And on a perfumed pillow, a woman once knelt in the dark, begging for love and summoning something far more dangerous. Next, that pious, quiet woman who replaced her, and maybe became queen in secret. You're still inside Versailles, but the mood has shifted. The scandals, the poisons, the parties that stretched until sunrise, they're all fading. The halls are quieter now, and the Sun King walks more slowly. His curls are powdered but thinning, his velvet slippers dragging a little more than they used to. The court still shimmers, but beneath the surface something's changed. The man who once reigned over one of the most extravagant, lust-soaked courts in Europe has turned inward. And in the heart of this strange transformation stands a woman who doesn't sparkle like the others. She doesn't throw lavish balls or wear the biggest jewels. She keeps mostly to herself, whispers instead of boasts, prays instead of plots. Her name is Françoise d'Aubigné, better known as Madame de Maintenon, and if the rumours are true, she became the king's secret wife. So how does one go from governess to possible queen? Slowly, carefully. And with impeccable timing, let's rewind. When Madame de Montespan was at her height, drowning in diamonds and dabbling, allegedly, in the occult, someone had to care for her children. Louis XIV, being the kind of king who fathered more kids than he had room for on the family tree, had a litter of little ones with Montespan. So who gets the job of raising them? Enter Françoise d'Aubigné, the widow of a failed poet and the granddaughter of a Protestant war criminal. Her resume doesn't exactly scream future queen, but she's educated, patient and devout. The opposite of Montespan in almost every way. Now here's your historical fact. Madame de Maintenon was likely secretly married to Louis XIV around 1683 after the death of his queen, Marie-Thérèse. There was no coronation, no official announcement, no grand portrait hanging in the Hall of Mirrors, but the court knew something had changed. She began appearing beside the king in more formal capacities. She was consulted on policy, and when she entered a room, people bowed deeper. She was, by all accounts, not just the king's favourite, she was his partner. But Maintenon didn't want to rule through seduction. Her power was softer, quieter, and arguably more effective. She influenced the king toward piety, modesty, and a new seriousness that transformed the tone of the French court. Under her gaze, the decadent masquerades faded. The risque theatre productions were replaced by religious plays. Gossip was muted, and courtiers learned to behave, or at least pretend to. And here's the fringe fact that still catches people off guard. Madame de Maintenon may have been the first royal mistress to run an elite girls' school in her spare time. It was called the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis, and she founded it in 1684 to educate the daughters of impoverished nobles. The school taught etiquette, prayer, and just enough Latin to keep things respectable, but not dangerous. No revolutionary ideas allowed, thank you very much. It was her legacy project, a strange fusion of compassion and class control, but of course not everyone loved her. In fact, most of the court loathed her. They missed the glittering Versailles of old, the parties, the art, the women who wore gold-dipped bodices and didn't make anyone feel guilty about it. Maintenon, with her sombre gowns and moralising air, was seen as a wet blanket in pearls. Montespan's supporters whispered that the king had been bewitched, not by black magic this time, but by boredom, yet the king remained loyal. Because here's what no one at court wanted to admit. He liked the peace. And here comes the historical debate that still bubbles among scholars and royal watchers alike. Did Louis XIV actually marry Madame de Maintenon, or was it just a deep platonic companionship? There's no surviving marriage record, and the ceremony, if it happened, was almost certainly private, witnessed only by a priest and a few trusted confidants. But her influence was undeniable. She wasn't just a mistress with power, she was treated, in many ways, like a queen minus the crown. That absence may have been the very thing that allowed her to flourish. She didn't threaten succession, she didn't meddle in dynastic affairs. She simply stayed and endured. You might be wondering, how does a king known for golden fountains and orgies end up in a monastic domestic arrangement? Honestly, age, regret, exhaustion. After decades of war, scandal and ceremonial excess, Louis was tired, and Maintenon gave him something that no mistress before her had ever offered. Stability. Not passion, not politics, but the quiet presence of someone who saw the man, not just the monarch. But don't mistake her serenity for weakness. Maintenon may have wrapped herself in lace and humility, but she wielded her influence with surgical precision. She helped orchestrate court appointments, encouraged censorship of immoral literature, and supported the king's most aggressive anti-Protestant measures, including the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which sent thousands of Huguenots fleeing the country. That decision, guided in part by her staunch Catholicism, had devastating consequences for France's economy and intellectual landscape. So yes, she was pious, but piety doesn't mean soft. And yet, despite her power, she never got her portrait hung among the royal queens. No coins bore her face, no official titles elevated her beyond Madame. In public, she remained half visible, a shadow behind the throne. Her letters, however, tell a fuller story. They reveal a woman balancing affection and ambition, duty and disillusionment. She loved the king. She also quietly resented the limitations of her station, and when Louis died in 1715, after a reign of 72 years, she didn't grieve publicly. She simply retired to her school and spent her final years surrounded by young girls reciting prayers. She died in 1719 at the age of 83. The court barely whispered her name. Versailles had already moved on to a new regency, a new style, a new kind of decadence. But the imprint of Madame de Maintenon lingered. Her quiet revolution had changed the monarchy, from fire and scandal to something cooler, more controlled. So tonight, close your eyes and picture a woman sitting beside a dying king, holding his hand, whispering psalms as the gilded candlelight flickers around them. No portraits, no crown, just the hush of history slowly folding around her. Next we return to Versailles again, but this time it's all powdered wigs, rococo absurdity, and a final mistress dancing on the edge of revolution. You're back in Versailles, but now it's so drenched in gold it almost feels fake, like a movie set about to crumble. The walls gleam, the ceilings drip with mythological paintings, and somewhere off in the distance a harpsichord plays for no one. It's the 1770s now, and France is teetering on a precipice it refuses to see. Nobles still twirl in embroidered silk and flirt beneath chandeliers while their people outside grow hungrier by the week. And in the centre of this glittering illusion stands Madame du Barry, the final mistress of a Bourbon king, spinning like a diamond-tipped top on the polished floor of a collapsing world. If you thought previous royal mistresses had complicated resumes, buckle up. Jeanne Bécu, later known as Madame du Barry, was born illegitimate, raised in poverty, and got her Saudart as a courtesan. That's the polite way of saying she was professionally charming to wealthy men. Her wit, beauty, and complete lack of shame made her irresistible to the right kind of patron, one who had no issue bending social norms. Through a series of very helpful male introductions and one extremely convenient arranged marriage to a low-ranking noble, Jeanne was transformed into Madame du Barry and promptly installed at Versailles as the maîtresse en titre of Louis XV. Yes, the same Louis who once reigned beside the formidable Pompadour. But by the time du Barry entered the scene, the king was, well, let's call it elderly, tired, depressed. He'd outlived too many wars, too many ministers, too many passions. And then came du Barry, young, radiant, playful, and as politically uninvolved as a silk glove. She didn't want to run the kingdom. She wanted parties, diamonds, and the king's affection, and she got all three. Now here's your historical fact. Madame du Barry was the last official royal mistress in France before the Revolution. That's not just trivia, it's symbolic. Her glittering rise and tragic end marked the final act of a very long royal play, one that had delighted in keeping powerful women close, but never quite on the throne. And as du Barry rose, so did public fury. Because while she was being gifted chateaux and oceans of pearls, the people of France were starting to ask whether maybe, just maybe, the entire monarchy was a bad idea. Du Barry's presence at Versailles was controversial from the beginning. She was despised by the nobility, not just because of her past, but because she refused to act ashamed of it. The Queen, Marie Leszczyńska, wouldn't speak to her. The Dauphine, soon to be Marie Antoinette, famously snubbed her for months, refusing to even acknowledge her presence. And du Barry, she simply smiled and wore more diamonds. But here's your fringe fact. Du Barry once commissioned a perfume so expensive it required hundreds of flowers per ounce and was said to make passers-by faint. It was that extra. She didn't just lean into luxury, she collapsed into it like a featherbed. And Louis, for all his accustomed fatigue, was enchanted. He kept her close, gave her everything she wanted, and let her be the beautiful distraction Versailles needed, while it ignored the chaos rumbling outside the gates. Of course, all distractions end. Louis XV died in 1774, and du Barry was forced to leave Versailles immediately. No ceremony, no farewell. She packed her gowns and jewellery and retreated to the Château de Louveciennes, a gorgeous estate gifted to her by the late king. There she tried to reinvent herself. Through more modest salons, supported artists, grew roses, but the tide had turned. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Madame du Barry a symbol of royal excess or simply a scapegoat for a dying system's failings? Some historians paint her as the embodiment of everything wrong with the Ancien Régime, a frivolous, expensive pet of a rotting monarchy. Others argue that she was more victim than villain, a woman who rose within the only system available to her, and played her role as graciously as she could. After all, she never held real power. She never advised on war or interfered with politics. She didn't poison anyone or orchestrate policy, she was simply there, sparkling. But the French Revolution didn't care about nuance. When the storm hit in 1789, Du Barry tried to keep her head down, but she had something everyone wanted, jewels, so she became a target for thieves and later for revolutionaries. She was arrested, interrogated, and eventually sentenced to death for crimes against the people, a vague catch-all phrase that boiled down to, "You were too shiny for too long." On December 8, 1793, she was carted off to the guillotine. Witnesses say she screamed and begged for her life the entire way there. A heartbreaking, undignified end for a woman who once ruled the most beautiful rooms in Europe. She wore a simple white dress, no perfume, no diamonds, just fear. And yet, in a strange way, she lingers. There's something ghostly about her story. The last mistress of a doomed monarchy, dying not for what she did, but for what she represented. A lifestyle, a world, a court built on glitter and denial. Her death was less about Jeanne Bécu and more about France tearing down its golden cage, one neck at a time. So tonight, picture Du Barry sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair, while outside Paris is sharpening its knives. She hums to herself, ignoring the banging at the gates. Because if there's one thing she's learned, it's that Versailles always pretends it's forever, until suddenly it's not. Next we head east to Russia, where royal mistresses weren't just lovers, they were hand-picked political tools, sometimes even by the Tsarina herself. You're moving east now into colder air and colder politics. The candlelight of Versailles gives way to the icy brilliance of St. Petersburg, where palaces rise from frostbitten streets and courtiers wear fur-lined coats over their silk. It's the late 18th century, and Russia is vast, unpredictable, and ruled by a woman whose power is legendary, whose intellect is unmatched. And whose bedchamber? Well, that's its own department of government. Welcome to the court of Catherine the Great, where lovers are called favourites, power is currency, and no one gets close to the Empress without stepping into her labyrinth of velvet and ice. Catherine didn't just take lovers. She selected them with the precision of a headhunter. Handsome? Yes, but also charming, obedient, and useful. These weren't trysts, they were appointments. To be a favourite of the Empress was to receive titles, lands, mansions, money, and influence, until, of course, the clock ran out. Because with Catherine, everyone had an expiration date. Let's start with the most famous of them all, Gregory Potemkin. He wasn't just a lover, he was possibly the love of her life. Their relationship was a storm of brilliance and chaos. He was a military genius, a flamboyant showman, and, allegedly, her secret husband. Historians still argue whether they ever married in a secret Orthodox ceremony, but what's not in doubt is that Catherine trusted him above anyone. He helped her run the empire, conquer Crimea, reform the army, and host diplomatic pageants so lavish they practically melted the Siberian permafrost. When their romance cooled, their political alliance did not. He continued to serve her until his death, loyal, irreplaceable, and deeply entwined in her vision of Russia. Here's your historical fact. Catherine the Great had at least a dozen known favourites, many of whom were elevated to noble status almost overnight. These men were often young, sometimes decades younger than Catherine, and were placed into her orbit via a careful vetting process that included, this is not a joke, a test run with one of her ladies-in-waiting to assess their sills before they were introduced to the Empress. Think of it as a central job interview, except the stakes were an imperial salary and an estate the size of Luxembourg. Now, let's slide into the fringe fact, and it's a wild one. There's a persistent urban legend that Catherine died while attempting intimacy with a horse. Yeah, that one. It's not true, at all, but it's been whispered through the centuries like a bad ghost story. The actual cause of death was a stroke in 1796, but the rumour stuck because, well, misogyny. Catherine was a woman with unapologetic sexual agency, and for centuries the world didn't know how to process that. So it buried her under scandalous myths. She wasn't punished for loving too many men, she was punished for loving them like a man would. But let's not pretend her court was a soft romantic place. It was brutal. To rise, you had to outmaneuver rivals, charm the Empress, and survive the gossip. Court factions aligned behind favourites, and as each man rose, so did his entourage. When they fell hard. Exile, disgrace, loss of property. It was a rotating game of imperial roulette. One day you're in the Empress's bed, the next you're under house arrest with your estate repossessed. Next, she'd say, metaphorically if not literally. The Empire moved on, which brings us to a curious scholarly debate. Were Catherine's favourites true partners in governance, or just glorified consorts? Some, like Potemkin, were undoubtedly instrumental in statecraft. Others, like Alexander Lanskoy, charming, sweet, and barely 20 when he met the Empress, were more decorative than strategic. Still, even the less political favourites had a role to play. They kept the Empress's spirits up, offered companionship, and ensured that her independence remained absolute. They were the human buffers between Catherine and the constant, exhausting demands of state. And through it all, she ruled, ruthlessly, intelligently, and with astonishing stamina. She expanded Russia's borders, reformed its legal codes, and played power politics with the best of Europe's monarchs. She corresponded with Voltaire, toyed with Enlightenment ideals, and then casually suppressed uprisings with military force when those ideals got inconvenient. Catherine didn't suffer contradiction, not from her ministers, not from her favourites, not from her enemies. You could please her, you could bow to her, but you never controlled her. Even her death couldn't diminish her myth. She left behind not just a mountain of reforms and a reorganised empire, but also a trail of broken hearts and awkward memoirs. Several of her former lovers lived long lives, some in quiet retirement, others reabsorbed into court life under new rulers. A few wrote about their time with her, some fondly, some bitterly, all of them clearly aware that they'd been close to the sun. Tonight, as you drift off under your blankets, picture that vast Russian winter outside a palace window. Inside, a fire crackles. A woman in ermine robes and diamond-studded slippers raises a glass of Hungarian wine. A young man, nervous, dazzling, enters the room, unaware that his life is about to change forever. Not because she loves him necessarily, but because he has potential, and for now, that's enough. Next, we head into the Napoleonic era where one royal mistress wasn't just an affair. She was a political pawn, a symbol of empire, and possibly the only woman who ever made the little emperor feel like a real man. You're no longer drifting through powdered palaces or candlelit salons. The world has changed. It's the early 1800s, and the air now smells like gunpowder and ambition. You're in Europe's age of empires, where battles redraw borders overnight and generals crown themselves emperors just because they can. Welcome to the whirlwind of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man with a tiny stature, a titanic ego, and a deep, complicated hunger for legacy. And standing beside him, just for a moment, is a woman history nearly forgot. Maria Walewska, the Polish noblewoman who became his mistress, his political bargaining chip, and his emotional lifeline in a world that adored and betrayed him in equal measure. Let's be honest, by the time Maria meets Napoleon, he's not exactly a romantic. He's in full emperor mode, storming across Europe with cannons, coronations, and a coat that always looks slightly too large for his shoulders. He's already dumped his first wife, Josephine, in favour of producing an heir. He's paranoid, constantly calculating, surrounded by sycophants and soldiers. Love is not the vibe. But when he meets Maria in 1807 at a ball in Warsaw, then under French control, something clicks. Maria's beautiful, poised, and very much not available. She's married to a much older Polish nobleman, but that hardly matters in this world. What does matter is that Poland, carved up by its neighbours and struggling to exist, sees an opportunity in Napoleon's obsession. And here's your historical fact. Polish patriots actively encouraged Maria to become Napoleon's mistress, hoping she could influence him to support the restoration of an independent Poland. Yes, you heard that right. Her affair was statecraft, a kind of soft diplomacy wrapped in lace and whispered promises. At first she resists. She's not thrilled about being used, either by her husband or by the men urging her into the emperor's arms. But Maria eventually gives in, not because of Napoleon's charm, which was debatable, but because she believes, like many Poles at the time, that his support could bring freedom to her people. Of course, that belief was wildly optimistic. Napoleon adored the idea of Poland, certainly. It was convenient for him, strategically positioned between Russia and Prussia, and he adored Maria, at least for a while. She travelled with him, wrote to him constantly, and bore him a son, Alexandre Walewski, who Napoleon acknowledged and supported. But despite the romantic fog, Maria's influence over actual policy, minimal. Napoleon promised a duchy, he delivered a puppet state. He whispered of independence but never went far enough to offend Russia. Still, Maria believed, or wanted to, she stayed by his side longer than most, enduring public humiliation, gossip and the cold indifference of French society which never accepted her. She wasn't royal, she wasn't French, and she wasn't Josephine. To the salons of Paris, Maria was little more than a decorative speed bump in Napoleon's relentless march towards self-destruction. Now, here's your fringe fact. Maria Walewska travelled to Elba after Napoleon's exile, one of the very few who did. While most of Europe was popping champagne and scrubbing him from their walls, Maria quietly made the journey to see the man she once believed could free her country. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion. Napoleon was bitter, bloated, and already plotting his return. Maria left shortly after, but the visit still stands out as a strange little coda to their affair, an echo of affection amid the rubble of empire. And that brings us to the debate historians still whisper about. Was Maria Walewska a patriot or a pawn? Was she using Napoleon to help her homeland, or was she simply used by everyone around her, from the Polish elite to the emperor himself? Some argue that she was deeply naive, that she clung to dreams Napoleon never intended to fulfill. Others see her as a savvy player, doing what she could with the tools she had. Because in a world where women couldn't hold office or command armies, sometimes the only way to influence power was to lie beside it. Her story doesn't end with exile, though. Maria eventually marries again, this time for love, and finds a kind of peace. But she dies young, at just 31, from complications after childbirth. Her son with Napoleon, Alexandre, goes on to become a French diplomat and eventually serves as foreign minister under Napoleon III. So yes, her bloodline did find its way back into the corridors of power, just not in the way she had hoped. And here's the heartbreak. Napoleon, for all his obsessions with legacy and destiny, barely mentions her again. She disappears from his letters, his memoirs, his myth. As he spirals toward Waterloo and eventual exile on St. Helena, it's Josephine he mourns. It's Josephine's name he mumbles in the damp Atlantic winds. Maria becomes just another footnote, soft, tragic, and quietly erased. But you, lying there in the dark, should remember her. Not just as the mistress who tried to love a man made of marble and ambition, but as the woman who believed, perhaps foolishly, that something personal could also be political. That her body, her beauty, her presence might steer the fate of nations. She wasn't the first to try, she wouldn't be the last. So tonight, picture a grand ball in Warsaw. The candles flicker, the violins swell. A man in a green military coat strides toward a woman in a pale blue gown. Around them, the court leans in, breathless. But this isn't a love story, this is a gamble. One that ends, like so many royal affairs, with a child, a war, and the sound of marching boots echoing down a road that never leads home. Next, get ready for the woman who might just be the most outrageous of them all, a dancer, a liar, and a scandal bomb who seduced her way into a throne and nearly took a kingdom down with her. Now you're ducking into Bavaria. Yes, that beer-drenched corner of 19th century Europe where fairy tale castles rise out of misty forests and monarchs go slowly, beautifully mad. It's 1846 when our next leading lady is born, and by the time you meet her, she's already a walking contradiction. A Catholic raised in Ireland, a trained dancer with a forged name, and a self-invented aristocrat who will one day become the royal mistress who broke a king. Meet Lola Montez, the most chaotic woman ever to waltz through a European court with nothing but a whip, a tutu, and an absolute disregard for consequences. Let's get this out of the way. Her name wasn't Lola Montez, she was born Eliza Gilbert, and she wasn't Spanish or noble, or even particularly well trained as a dancer. But she had one magical talent. She knew how to become whoever she needed to be. And in 9th century Europe, where half the aristocracy was drunk on romanticism and opium, that was enough. By the time she reached her early 20s, she'd already performed across the continent as the sultry Spanish dancer Lola Montez, trailing scandals like perfume. Her act? Half flamenco, half fan dance, all insinuation. Then she gets to Munich and everything goes sideways. The city is cold, tidy, conservative. King Ludwig III of Bavaria is old, bored, and increasingly unstable. He collects art, obsesses over beauty, and has a long history of taking official favourites. He's exactly the kind of man who'd fall for a woman who walks into his court without an invitation, declares herself a countess, and offers to perform a private dance. Within days, Lola has moved into a palace wing. Within weeks, she's got a title, Countess of Landsfeld, and within months, She's writing laws. Here's your historical fact. Lola Montez influenced state policy in Bavaria and was granted her own guards and pension. She wasn't just a royal fling, she was a political force. She had Ludwig fire ministers who didn't respect her. She pushed for liberal reforms, supposedly on behalf of the students and artists she liked to flirt with. She received audiences, issued orders, and once literally horsewhipped a nobleman who insulted her in public. The court was scandalized, obviously. But Ludwig? He was smitten. And now for your fringe fact, the kind you're going to roll your eyes at and then secretly Google later. Lola Montez had a pet bear. Yes, a bear. Rumour says she kept it leashed on palace grounds and fed it pastries soaked in brandy. Was this confirmed? Not exactly. But would it be the least believable part of her story? Absolutely not. Back in Munich, the people were less enchanted. The press called her a demoness, a witch, a she-devil in Spanish satin. The church denounced her. Riots broke out, students protested, nobles threatened rebellion. Even Ludwig's own ministers begged him to let her go. But Lola knew her strengths. She played the part of victim, muse, seductress, whatever would keep her in his arms and, more importantly, in his palace. But eventually, even fairy tales sour. By 1848, Europe was erupting in revolution. Bavaria's people were sick of a foreign courtesan writing decrees and insulting their institutions. Under massive pressure, Ludwig finally asked Lola to leave. She left, temporarily, then came back, then left again. Then came the moment. Ludwig, refusing to rule without her, abdicated. Yes, you heard that right. A king walked away from his throne in part because he couldn't bear to give up the woman who once said, "A man who cannot command himself should not command others." You can almost hear Lola throwing that quote across a room full of broken glass and rejected marriage proposals. And here's the scholarly question that always follows her. Was Lola Montez a revolutionary or a wrecking ball? Did she use her power to push for progress in a rigid society, or did she simply burn everything down because it felt good? Some historians argue she supported constitutional reform, liberal arts funding and individual freedoms. Others say she was a narcissistic grifter who destroyed a monarchy for nothing but vanity. The answer, as always, probably lives somewhere between champagne and delusion. After Ludwig's abdication, Lola didn't vanish. She just kept going. She toured Europe again, dodging lawsuits and fleeing creditors. She published a guidebook called The Arts of Beauty. Yes, seriously. And eventually wound up in the United States, reinventing herself once again. She gave public lectures in San Francisco, married again, divorced again, and travelled with a show titled Lola Montez in Person. Because at this point she was a character. Her life was performance art. If reality didn't give her a stage, she just built one from lies and leopard print. She died in 1861 in New York, broke and barely 40. Her final years were spent in a fog of religious guilt and illness, possibly syphilis. The woman who once caused kings to fall and cities to riot was buried quietly, with no bear, no fan, no crown, just a headstone and some whispers. But here's the thing, Lola Montez didn't accidentally stumble into power. She ran toward it, teeth bared and heels high. She didn't wait to be chosen. She walked into royal palaces with a lie in one hand and a plan in the other. And for a while, it worked. Because sometimes the world doesn't need another noble bride. It needs a hurricane in heels. So tonight, picture her in that Munich palace, standing on a table, brandy glass raised, cheeks flushed, issuing commands no one asked for, while Ludwig stares at her like she's the sun. Because in that moment she was. And if it all crashed down tomorrow, well, she'd already packed her whip. Next, we stay in Imperial Russia for whispers, shadows, and a mistress network so tangled it makes Versailles look like a tea party. Now you're moving through the hush of Imperial Russia, where snow falls like judgment and secrets are currency. The palaces are massive, cold, and creaking with the weight of too much gold and not enough truth. You walk past guards with fur hats and unreadable faces. Behind every brocade curtain, someone is eavesdropping. Every smile is suspicious. And in the middle of this frozen world, you enter a place not found on any official map, the Tsarina's Whisper Network, a sprawling web of unofficial power, female ambition, and royal intimacy where mistresses, lovers, and lady confidants don't just entertain, they inform, spy, blackmail, and sometimes disappear. Here in Russia, unlike in France or England, the concept of the royal mistress wasn't exactly enshrined in velvet. There was no maîtresse en titre, no open acknowledgement. These women didn't get titles or parades or poems written in their honour. They got rooms in the Winter Palace and guards who didn't make eye contact. They got everything and nothing. Their power was real, but it lived in shadows. Let's set our scene in the early 1800s. Tsar Alexander I is on the throne. He's thoughtful, tormented, and politically slippery. Publicly, he's married to a devout German princess. Privately, he's entangled with several women, including Maria Narishkina, the unofficial but long-term mistress who bore him 4 children and moved through the court like a silk-wrapped rumour. She wasn't granted titles or lands. She wasn't discussed at court dinners, but everyone knew. Everyone always knows. Here's your historical fact. Maria Narishkina accompanied the Tsar to Vienna during the 1815 Congress, appearing at official events and receiving the kind of treatment normally reserved for queens, just without the paperwork. She had no formal role, but she carried herself like royalty, travelled with an entourage, and whispered into the Tsar's ear with the kind of familiarity that made ministers nervous, and for good reason. Her influence was deeply resented by both the Empress and the more conservative factions of court. But Alexander protected her, sometimes to his own political detriment. And that was only one piece of the puzzle. You see, in Russia, royal mistresses weren't just lovers. They were political messengers, soft interrogators, even secret keepers. Because in a court ruled by fear, silence, and the occasional accidental poisoning, the woman in the royal bedroom often knew more than the cabinet minister in the front row. And sometimes, she was the only person who could tell the Tsar the truth. Which brings us to Alexander's grandmother, Catherine the Great. Yes, we've already met her, but we need to pause here again, because she created the infrastructure that allowed these women to flourish. Her favourites didn't just warm her bed, they reported back on the moods of generals, the rumours among nobles, the shifting tides in foreign courts. She understood better than anyone that intimacy could be intelligence. And even after her death, the system lingered. But with Alexander, it morphed. His court was more paranoid, more secretive. He surrounded himself with spiritual advisors, mystics, and pious reformers, all while maintaining private rooms where only a select few women had access. It was said you could judge the mood of the empire by who was seen leaving his apartments at dawn. A duchess, good day for foreign policy. A dancer, expect delays. Now here's your fringe fact, and it's deliciously strange. Some mistresses in Imperial Russia were reportedly vetted by retired courtiers and widowed noblewomen before being introduced to the Tsar. These were women with social standing but nothing left to lose, ideal to act as matchmakers/scouts. They'd report back on the candidate's manners, religion, and yes, bedroom reputation. Think of them as aristocratic talent agents who specialised in seduction diplomacy. But being part of this whisper network wasn't always glamorous. It was terrifying. One wrong word, one political shift, and you could be exiled to Siberia, if you were lucky. Poisoning, suicide, and carriage accidents were common tools in the imperial arsenal. Lovers of the Tsar were constantly watched, even after their usefulness had passed. Some were married off to obscure nobles, others simply vanished. To serve at the pleasure of the Romanovs was to live in constant glittering peril. And here's the scholarly debate. Did the whisper network make the Russian monarchy more stable or more unstable? Some historians argue that these behind-the-scenes operators helped moderate the Tsar's extremes, passing him unfiltered information when his ministers were too afraid. Others say the system fostered corruption, manipulation, and favouritism, encouraging dangerous personalism in an already volatile regime. The truth, as always, is frostbitten and buried under layers of velvet. One of the most haunting examples of this system's danger comes later, in the early 20th century, with Tsarina Alexandra and her infamous spiritual advisor/possible mystic lover, Grigory Rasputin. No, he wasn't a mistress, obviously, but he occupied the same intimate, untouchable space. He entered the royal household through whispers and stayed there through manipulation, scandal, and the desperation of a family clinging to power. The Rasputin story is the grotesque evolution of the whisper network, where influence over the throne becomes something so corrosive it topples an empire. But back in the 1800s, as you walk the long corridors of the Winter Palace, you pass portraits of women with knowing eyes and perfect posture, women who never held a title, but reshaped policy with a glance, a touch, a perfectly timed tear. They aren't in the official histories, but they're everywhere if you know where to look. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, imagine the chill of Russian marble under your feet. Picture a fire burning low in a private salon. A woman sits in the glow, brushing out her hair, knowing that tomorrow she might be kissed, interrogated, promoted or banished. She doesn't cry, she smiles, because in this world survival isn't about beauty or birth. It's about listening better than anyone else, and never, ever speaking first. Next, we unravel the tangled world of morganatic marriages, where mistresses were wives in everything but name, and sometimes not even that. Tonight, you're stepping into the murkiest category of royal relationships yet, the no man's land between mistress and wife, where women were both insiders and outsiders, celebrated and hidden, adored and legally invisible. This is the world of morganatic marriage, a term so obscure it sounds like a bad brand of cigarettes. But trust me, it's the secret architecture behind some of the strangest royal love stories in European history. Here, the mistresses don't just sleep with kings, they marry them, but with conditions, very specific, very humiliating conditions. Morganatic marriages, also called left-handed marriages in some languages, were essentially royal loopholes. The concept was simple but brutal. A monarch could marry someone of lower status, read commoner, courtesan, scandal-plagued baroness, without giving them or their children any claim to the throne, titles, or inheritance. It was like saying, I love you enough to marry you, but not enough to let you matter. The practice was especially common in the stiff-necked courts of Germany and Austria, where bloodlines were everything and noble pride made Versailles look like a community theatre. The Habsburgs. Obsessed with morganatic marriages, they used them like romantic fire extinguishers, safe ways to contain royal lust without burning down the line of succession. Let's start with one of the most famous cases, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, the same one whose assassination triggered World War I. He fell in love with Countess Sophie Chotek, a lady-in-waiting who, while noble, was not noble enough for imperial standards. Franz was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, was absolutely not having it. The solution? Morganatic marriage. Franz could marry Sophie, but their kids would never inherit the throne, and Sophie herself would never be called empress. At official events she had to walk behind him, even behind junior royals. At court functions, she wasn't allowed to sit by his side. Here's your historical fact. At the couple's funeral, following their 1914 assassination in Sarajevo, the imperial court refused to give Sophie a full royal burial. That's right. Even in death, she wasn't treated as a legitimate royal. The empire had rules, and love didn't get to rewrite them. It's one of the most tragic morganatic marriages in history, and the cruelty wasn't even subtle, it was policy. But Franz and Sophie weren't the only ones trapped in this half-life of royal marriage. Across Europe, especially in the smaller German states, morganatic wives became a kind of open secret. They had titles, usually made-up ones like Princess of Hohenhuckers, and lived in palaces, but were excluded from ceremonies, family trees, and political discussions. Sometimes they were former actress, sometimes just noble women from the wrong branch of a family tree. Always they were treated as a sort of royal error, acknowledged only when absolutely necessary. And now here's your fringe fact. In certain courts, morganatic marriages were sealed with a left-handed handshake during the ceremony, hence the term left-handed marriage. The symbolism was grim. The left hand was traditionally associated with lesser promises, even evil in some traditions. So imagine marrying the love of your life and doing it with the hand historically linked to betrayal. Romantic! Of course, morganatic wives weren't powerless. Some became deeply influential within their limited lanes. They entertained diplomats, advised husbands in private, and raised children who, while barred from the throne, often went on to become major cultural or military figures. But the relationship was always steeped in tension. They were royal but not, visible but not, beloved but not quite respectable. Take Ludwig Verfeer of Hesse-Darmstadt, who married Countess Magdalene of Hochberg, his longtime mistress, morganatically. She was loyal, cultured, and clearly adored him, but even after years of marriage, she wasn't allowed to sit beside him at banquets, not unless someone got sick or bailed last minute. It's giving bridesmaid, never the bride, but make it 19th century dynastic politics. And then there's King Leopold of Besen of Belgium, who married Arcadie Clara, a baron's daughter who bore him 2 sons. They never married officially, but he did everything he could to legitimize them socially. Titles, pensions, the works. Still, they were denied inheritance rights and royal recognition. Arcady spent most of her life in a kind of royal limbo, never quite mistress, never quite consort, always teetering on the edge of acceptance. So what's the scholarly debate here? Were morganatic marriages a tool of patriarchal control, or a quiet subversion of it? On one hand, these unions kept royal bloodlines clean, don't make that face, it's their word, not mine, and protected the throne from inappropriate heirs. On the other hand, they allowed royals to marry for love, or at least affection, without throwing the kingdom into succession chaos. Some historians argue that they were a progressive compromise in a rigid system. Others see them as a cruel half-measure that humiliated women and forced them into a life of near-constant apology for their existence. It's hard not to sympathise. Imagine living in a palace surrounded by silk and silver, but constantly being reminded, by officials, by relatives, by protocol, that you are less than. Imagine being told your children, no matter how loved or intelligent, will never count. That's what it meant to be a morganatic wife. You had the love, you had the luxury, but you didn't get to keep the legacy you saw. So tonight, picture a woman standing in a ballroom doorway, perfectly dressed, perfectly sweelant. She watches her husband toast another noble family, one whose bloodline is older than hers, even if their hearts are not. She smiles. She sips champagne, and she stays in the shadows, because that's where love like hers lives. Next, we peek into the foggy heart of the British monarchy, where mourning is endless, and one queen's most intimate relationships remain shrouded in velvet and mystery. Tonight, you're walking straight into the black lace veil of Queen Victoria's grief, where love is memorialised in marble and obsession hides behind perfectly preserved hairlocks. The candles in Windsor are always half melted, the portraits covered in dust, and the silence is so thick you can practically choke on it. For most people, death ends a marriage. For Victoria, it just changed the tone. Because after Prince Albert died in 1861, she didn't stop loving. She simply started loving differently, and depending on who you ask, maybe even more intimately than ever before. This is the shadowy, whispered story of Victoria's post-widowhood relationships with her servants. And whether or not they were romantic, let's just say it depends how closely you read the footnotes. Let's start with the grief. When Albert died of typhoid at the age of 42, Victoria lost more than a husband. She lost her emotional ballast, her political partner, her calendar manager, her wardrobe advisor, and basically the only person who could tell her when she was being ridiculous without getting banished. She wore black for the rest of her life, literally the next 40 years. The royal court went into mourning so long that entire generations of Britons grew up thinking joy was illegal. Ministers rolled their eyes, Parliament sighed, but no one dared pull back the curtain on the Queen's grief, not when she seemed so fiercely, almost theatrically committed to it. And then came John Brown. Here's your historical fact. John Brown was a Scottish servant who became Queen Victoria's closest companion, and possibly something more. He was rough, blunt, and famously disrespectful of royal protocol. He called her woman instead of your majesty. He swore in front of her. He argued with ministers. He reportedly slept outside her door for protection, and she loved him for it. Victoria once called him the best, truest heart that ever beat. When he died in 1883, she had a memorial erected to him on the grounds of Balmoral, and she mourned him just as obsessively as she had Albert. Now here's your fringe fact, and it's juicy. After Victoria's death in 1901, her doctor reported finding a lock of John Brown's hair, a photo of him, and his mother's wedding ring tucked inside her coffin, placed in her hand. She had specifically requested it. The Queen of the British Empire, Empress of India, ruler of nearly a quarter of the world, was buried clutching the mementos of a common-born Scottish gilly. Make of that what you will. Of course, court gossip exploded. Ministers whispered. Her children fumed. They referred to Brown as that dreadful man, and accused him of manipulating the Queen. Political cartoonists mocked the relationship, calling her Mrs. Brown in sly nods to a marriage that may or may not have happened in secret. Some historians even argue that the two were secretly wed, perhaps in a private ceremony officiated by one of her more pliable chaplains. There's no hard evidence, just diaries that mysteriously vanished and letters that no longer exist. And then, because one brooding servant apparently wasn't enough, Abdul Karim arrived. Karim was a young Indian clerk gifted to Victoria as part of her Jubilee celebrations in 1887. He was supposed to serve her meals. Instead, he became her munshi, her teacher, her companion, her daily obsession. She took Urdu lessons from him, gave him land, titles, jewellery, installed him in quarters just down the hall. She wrote hundreds of letters to him, many in Hindi. She defended him against the royal household, who openly resented his presence and insisted he be treated as a gentleman, even as everyone else tried to humiliate him back into submission. Sound familiar? Here's the scholarly debate. Were these relationships romantic, platonic, or something in between? Deep emotional partnerships that defy easy categories? Some historians believe Victoria, starved of emotional intimacy after Albert's death, formed intense attachments that blurred the lines between friendship and romance. Others think she was simply desperate for connection, someone to listen to her stories, treat her like a person instead of a monarch, and challenge her worldview without political consequences. Still others, usually armed with very pointed diary entries, are convinced that at least one of these men shared her bed. But without definitive proof, it remains one of the British monarchy's most tantalising enigmas. Here's another twist. After Victoria's death, her son Edward VII immediately banished Abdul Karim, burned most of their correspondence, and sent him back to India with strict instructions never to return. Why? Because the royal family was mortified by the relationship. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to. They wanted their empire back in its clean hierarchical place, not tangled up in scandal and spiritual bonding sessions in Urdu. So they deleted him from the record, or tried to, but you can't bury affection forever. Eventually his journals resurfaced. The truth leaked back out, and while neither John Brown nor Abdul Karim were ever declared mistresses, their closeness with the Queen puts them squarely in the same orbit. They received gifts, access, power. They heard her secrets. They slept in the same buildings, travelled in the same carriages, influenced her decisions. Whatever the exact nature of these bonds, one thing is clear. Victoria didn't stop loving after Albert died. She just loved differently, more privately, more dangerously, and perhaps more honestly. So tonight, picture the aging Queen in her black gown seated by the fire at Osborne House, listening to Urdu poetry or arguing in thick Scots with a man no one else could control. The world saw her as the grandmother of Europe, but behind closed doors, she was a woman who needed companionship, comfort, and maybe, just maybe, someone to hold her hand when no one else dared. Next, we slide into Edward VII's glittering wake, where the royal mistresses came back in full force, this time on yachts, at horse races, and dripping in diamonds, all while redefining the crown's public image. Now you're stepping into a different kind of royal court. The late Victorian age has slipped into the Edwardian era, and everything suddenly feels a little looser. The corsets are still tight, but the rules? Not so much. You can hear jazz on the edge of the horizon. There's electricity in the walls, literal and figurative, and the royal family, still covered in brooches and medals, is trying to figure out how to stay relevant in a rapidly modernising world. At the heart of this transition is King Edward VII, a man who spent most of his life waiting for the throne, and most of that waiting period in bed. Specifically, other people's beds. This is a man whose reign was short, but whose romantic resume could fill a 4-volume novel series. Tonight, you step into the court of a monarch who made mistresses a royal tradition, and who used his lovers not just for pleasure, but as a kind of soft diplomacy. Let's start with the man himself. Edward, nicknamed Bertie by his family, was the oldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. But that's about where the similarities end. Where Victoria was stiff and obsessed with propriety, Bertie was indulgent, social, and famously not built for abstinence. He spent over 6 decades as the Prince of Wales, a title that came with almost no power and far too much leisure. So what did he do with his time? He perfected the art of being a royal lover. Now here's your historical fact. Edward VII had at least 50 known mistresses, including aristocrats, actresses, courtesans, and one woman whose claim to fame was inventing the erotic photograph. He didn't hide these relationships. In fact, many of them were practically public, some even appearing alongside him at state functions. His mistresses were part of his image, a rakish, lovable bon vivant who brought charm to a monarchy weighed down by moralism and mourning. And the crown didn't crack. In fact, it sparkled. Edward's most famous mistress was Alice Keppel, who you'll hear more about shortly. But before her came a rotating cast of women who helped shape not just Edward's social calendar, but Britain's political one. These weren't just lovers. They were information brokers, social fixers, and informal ambassadors. One of his early companions, Lily Langtry, was a literal superstar, an actress, racehorse owner, and fashion icon. She dazzled the court with her wit and style, and Edward proudly paraded her around, even arranging for her to sit in his royal box at the opera, while his wife was elsewhere. Then there was Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, politically progressive aristocrat who was involved in labour rights and education reform. She wasn't content to be decorative. She used her closeness to Edward to push social change, and though their affair eventually fizzled, Daisy stayed in Edward's orbit as a friend and social force. These weren't one-night flings. These women were part of a network that kept the monarchy charming, relevant, and just a little bit scandalous. Exactly what the press and public, oddly enough, had started to crave. Now, your fringe fact for the evening. Edward VII had a custom-built reinforced bed, nicknamed the Siege Machine, designed for vigorous romantic encounters with his mistresses. It lived at the famed Le Chabanais brothel in Paris and allegedly featured silken ropes, pulleys, and mirrored panels. It's said that he enjoyed elaborate roleplay scenarios, often dressed in full military regalia. Honestly, once you've been the Prince of Wales for 60 years, you have to find some way to keep things interesting. But what sets Edward apart from other monarchs isn't just the number of women or the theatrics. It's that he made being a playboy king part of the brand. When he finally took the throne in 1901 at the age of 59, people already knew who he was. He'd been on the front page of gossip papers for decades. He smoked 12 cigars a day, ate 5-course meals, dressed impeccably, and flirted with literally everyone. And somehow it worked. He became a kind of people's king, not despite his mistresses, but because of them. And here's the scholarly debate. Did Edward VII's open indulgence in extramarital affairs weaken or strengthen the British monarchy? Some argue that he degraded the dignity of the crown, turning it into a cocktail party joke. Others say he humanised it. After the gloom of Victoria's mourning, Bertie's court was lively, cosmopolitan, and scandalously alive. His lovers weren't seen as homewreckers, they were celebrities. Women like Lily Langtry were admired, not shamed. They set trends, attended state dinners, and sometimes even smoothed over diplomatic tension. One rumour suggests that a French treaty got signed only because the mistress of an ambassador had once been in Edward's Paris circle. And while Edward was no feminist, let's be clear, his taste in women included some truly formidable minds. He enjoyed conversation, culture, and confidence. The Edwardian mistress wasn't a background figure. She was front and centre, managing salons, sponsoring artists, hosting political dinners, and influencing men who technically ran empires. Technically, that's not to say everything was sunshine and champagne. His wife, Queen Alexandra, was admired for her grace and endurance, but even she had limits. While she tolerated many of his flings, she reportedly refused to attend events where certain mistresses were present. Court etiquette had to be rewritten on the fly, with entire seating charts dictated not by political rank, but by which woman the king was currently sleeping with. Awkward. Still, Edward pulled it off. His reign lasted only 9 years, but it's remembered as one of surprising popularity and social ease. He modernised the monarchy, not with laws or reforms, but with style, charm, and a careful, almost choreographed management of scandal. And his mistresses, they were part of that choreography, not hidden, not apologised for, just included, naturally. So tonight, imagine the king leaning over a card table at some glittering country estate, cigar in hand, winking at a duchess or courtier, while his current mistress critiques his hand of bridge. The fire crackles, the wine flows, and somewhere in the corner, a diplomat takes notes, not on treaties but on who's holding court tonight. Because under Edward VII, love and politics weren't separate, they were the same room. Next we meet the mistress who defined the Edwardian era more than any other, and whose bloodline still pulses quietly through the heart of today's royal family. Tonight, you meet a woman whose influence lingers like perfume long after her death, on the walls of grand estates, in whispered family trees, and yes, even in the veins of today's royals. She wasn't just a mistress, she was a dynastic hinge, a social powerhouse, and the kind of woman who could ruin a man's reputation with a raised eyebrow, or save it with a glance. This is the story of Alice Keppel, the most enduring mistress of King Edward VII, and the woman who played the long game so perfectly, her descendants are still invited to royal weddings. You don't get more legacy than that. Let's rewind to 1898. Edward is still the Prince of Wales, bloated with boredom and brandy. He's in his late 50s, prone to long dinners, longer affairs, and increasingly plagued by public gossip. The press is no longer turning a blind eye to his lifestyle. The monarchy's image is wobbling. And then, Alice Keppel. She's 30, married to a charming but mostly useless army officer, and known in London society for her grace, discretion, and impossibly calming voice. Within months, she becomes the king's mistress. But unlike the actresses and scandal-baiting countesses before her, Alice knows exactly how to play the room. Here's your historical fact. Alice Keppel acted as both confidant and unofficial advisor to Edward VII during his final years, soothing political tensions and even mediating disputes between him and government ministers. She wasn't just a royal accessory, she was a trusted operator. Politicians came to her to pass messages to the king. Diplomats confided in her. She once reportedly saved a treaty negotiation by convincing Edward to change his mind over breakfast. That's not a lover, that's diplomatic infrastructure in heels. And what made Alice different was her strategy. She wasn't there for a scandal, she wasn't there for diamonds, she was there for longevity. She made sure her husband, George Keppel, got a steady stream of appointments and promotions. She kept her name out of newspapers. She didn't compete with other women, she outlasted them, and she never ever humiliated the Queen. In fact, Queen Alexandra tolerated Alice's presence because Alice made herself useful, kind, smooth, harmless on the surface, but sharp as a sabre underneath. Now here's your fringe fact. Alice Keppel was the great-grandmother of Camilla Parker Bowles. Yes, that Camilla, now Queen Camilla, which means Edward VII's favourite mistress is the direct ancestor of the woman who eventually became the wife of King Charles III. So if you're ever wondering whether royal mistresses leave a mark, just remember, sometimes they leave one that sits on the throne. And here comes the juicy paradox. Despite her powerful place in the king's life, Alice Keppel was never officially acknowledged by the crown. She didn't receive a title. She wasn't gifted a country estate or made a duchess. Instead, she was allowed to exist in the margins, richly, safely, but never fully sanctioned. The rules were clear, you could be close to the king, just not too close to history. But Edward made it obvious how much she meant to him. He visited her frequently, sometimes daily. She accompanied him on trips abroad under the guise of social companionship. And in his final illness, when Edward lay dying in 1910, Alice was summoned to his bedside, despite the protests of the royal family. She arrived, red-eyed and silent, and when she left the room, it was said she collapsed in tears, crying, "I never did any harm, I only tried to do some good." Cue the scholarly debate. Was Alice Keppel a stabilising influence on a scandal-prone monarch, or a manipulator who cloaked personal ambition in good manners? Some historians argue that her presence softened Edward's excesses, calmed his temper, and brought a needed diplomatic touch to a very undiplomatic king. Others say she was a skilled social climber, who understood that being the king's mistress was the best ticket out of middle-class obscurity. Either way, she succeeded. In a world where mistresses were often tossed aside the moment they aged, Alice built a legacy that outlived the monarchy she served. And here's the thing, she wasn't interested in torching it all. She was a traditionalist in pearls. She believed in the institution, even as she undermined it from within. She supported Edward without trying to replace the Queen, and she managed her own family in parallel. Her daughters married well, her husband kept his dignity, and her social calendar remained full until her final years. After Edward's death, Alice quietly left the inner royal circle. She didn't write memoirs, she didn't sell letters, she didn't do interviews. She knew the game, and she'd already won. She retired to Italy and lived in Florence until her death in 1947, surrounded by art, wine, and a carefully curated silence. And when Camilla began her relationship with Prince Charles decades later, and family members couldn't help but smile and say, well, it runs in the blood, to tonight, imagine Alice stepping out of a carriage at Buckingham Palace, not a hair out of place, glancing once at the press, then gliding through the side entrance, not because she had to sneak in, but because she knew exactly where to be. She isn't scandal, she's survival. She's the blueprint for modern royal mistresses, visible enough to be important, invisible enough to never be dangerous. And her legacy, well, it's sitting on a velvet cushion somewhere, probably sipping tea and ignoring the headlines. Next we move from love affairs to full-blown royal earthquakes, when a mistress didn't just steal a king's heart, she stole his crown. Tonight, you're not slipping into a royal bedchamber, you're stepping into a constitutional crisis. There's no velvet curtain to draw here, no discreet exit through the servants' door. This is a royal affair that detonated like a scandal bomb across the entire British Empire and left pieces of the monarchy scattered on the front pages of every paper in the world. Tonight, you're sitting beside Wallis Simpson, the woman who, depending on whom you ask, either saved King Edward VIII from himself or seduced a nation's future straight into chaos. This wasn't just a royal mistress, this was the mistress who made a king choose, the crown or her. Now let's be real. The British monarchy had seen scandal before. Mistresses were practically ceremonial. There had been actresses, courtesans, duchesses, dancers, even some discreet male companions here and there. But by the time Edward VIII, known as David to his family, took the throne in 1936, things had changed. The press was powerful, the public had opinions, and the royal family had rules, or at least they were trying to. They needed order, stability, and tradition. What they got was a king with all the restraint of a tabloid prince and a deeply inconvenient obsession with a twice-divorced American socialite. Here's your historical fact. Edward VIII abdicated the throne in December 1936 so he could marry Wallis Simpson, making him the only British monarch in history to voluntarily step down, and all for love, or lust, or codependency. The motivations are still up for debate, but the outcome is not. The crown passed to his brother, George VI, and the monarchy was yanked back from the brink by the most introverted man in England. And Wallis? She went from mistress to duchess in the messiest way imaginable. But let's rewind, because this story doesn't work without context. Wallis wasn't born into royalty, or even close. She was from Baltimore, raised with just enough money to fake a pedigree. Her first marriage ended in divorce. Her second, to shipping executive Ernest Simpson, was crumbling by the time she met the Prince of Wales at partings in the early 30s. She was stylish, witty, and uninterested in royal protocol, which of course made her absolutely irresistible to a man raised under the shadow of obligation. Edward fell here hard. He lavished her with jewellery, nicknamed her "my beloved Wallis," and began taking her everywhere. She was introduced to his family, awkward. She was given rooms near his, awkwarder. And eventually she was treated not just like a girlfriend, but like a queen in waiting. Except there was one enormous problem. She was not legally available. Divorce was a huge deal in 1930s Britain, especially for the monarch, who also held the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which opposed remarriage after divorce if the ex-spouse was still living, which he was. So was her first one. The math wasn't good. Now here's your fringe fact. Wallis Simpson never actually wanted to be queen. Multiple letters and sources suggest she was terrified of the public role and overwhelmed by the media frenzy. Some even argue she hoped Edward would tire of her before it all went too far. Instead, he doubled down, proposed, pushed harder, and when his government tried to block the marriage, Edward responded with essentially, "Okay then, I'll take the crown and shove it in a drawer." Cue the constitutional crisis. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made it clear. The British government, the Church and the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, etc., would not accept Wallis as queen. They feared scandal, moral outrage, and public instability. Edward tried suggesting a morganatic marriage where he could stay king and marry Wallis without making her queen. The idea was immediately rejected. No compromise, no deal, just a wall of no. And so, on December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the abdication papers stating he could not do his job without the help and support of the woman I love. The next day, he broadcast his farewell over the radio, and you could almost hear Buckingham Palace collectively grinding its teeth. Wallis, meanwhile, had fled to France during the worst of the press firestorm. When they finally reunited, it wasn't exactly a royal fairy tale. It was quiet, a little bleak and permanently awkward, because the world had chosen sides, and a lot of them weren't on hers. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Wallis Simpson a manipulative social climber, or a scapegoat for a king who was never fit to rule? Some historians argue that she pushed Edward, using her influence to bend him away from duty. Others paint a more sympathetic picture of a woman who never asked for a throne and was dragged into history by a man more obsessed with her than with empire. What's clear is that Edward's abdication wasn't just about love, it was about resistance, to expectation, to tradition, to the idea that personal happiness should always come second to crown and country. The couple married in June 1937 in France, without a single member of the royal family attending. Edward was made Duke of Windsor, Wallis became a duchess, and they spent most of their lives in exile, hosting glamorous parties for the bored elite and awkwardly hanging around the edges of royal society. Edward never stopped resenting the decision. Wallis never stopped being blamed for it. And here's the eerie twist. Wallis lived long enough to see her great-nephew Prince Charles fall in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, another woman scorned for being the wrong choice. History didn't repeat exactly, but the shadow of Wallis loomed long over the royal playbook. Her story became a cautionary tale, a modern myth about love, sacrifice, and what happens when a monarch chooses passion over duty. So, tonight, picture a Parisian apartment filled with orchids and regret. Edward plays records from his youth. Wallis sips from a glass of something strong, flips through a tabloid and raises an eyebrow. Outside, a photographer waits. They're not royalty anymore, but they're still interesting, still scandalous, still together. Next, we leave the bedrooms behind for a minute and dig into the unspoken code of mistresshood itself, the rules, rewards, and quiet punishments of those who dance the razor-thin line between courtly love and total ruin. Tonight, you step away from the candlelit scandals and royal portraits to wander down a hallway far more private, lined not with paintings, but with silence. You've met the women who captivated kings, who changed empires and crowned illegitimate sons in the backrooms of palaces. But what held all of that together wasn't just beauty or charm or clever bedroom manoeuvring. It was a system, a rhythm, a code, unspoken, unwritten, and incredibly precise. This is the world of the courtesan's code, the quiet rules every royal mistress had to follow if she wanted to survive the attention, the power, and most importantly the fall, because make no mistake, in the high-stakes theatre of monarchy, being a mistress wasn't some soft-focus romance. It was dangerous high-wire performance with no net. One wrong move and you weren't just out of favour, you were banished, disgraced, erased. The role demanded emotional precision, physical perfection, and political awareness sharper than a king's dagger. And the women who lasted, they understood that the crown might sleep beside you, but it was never yours to touch. So let's break down the rules. The first, most sacred of all, discretion is survival. You don't write letters that can be found. You don't speak in crowded rooms. You never brag. This one rule could make or break a mistress before she even touched a satin bedsheet. Gossip has always been royal currency, and if you gave the court too much to whisper about, you weren't mysterious, you were dangerous. Madame de Pompadour mastered this rule. So did Alice Keppel. Even Wallis Simpson, amid global headlines, kept her personal letters cold, factual, unrevealing. She knew the game, even when she'd already lost the throne. Rule 2, you serve a function or you don't last long. Beauty gets you in the door. Usefulness keeps you in the room. The most successful mistresses weren't just pretty, they were political tools. Madame de Maintenon offered Louis XIV stability and quiet influence. Louise de Kérouaille helped ferry information between the French and English courts. Nell Gwynn. She was so beloved by the people that having her around actually helped the monarchy's image. Mistresses who couldn't make themselves useful, who didn't bring value beyond sex, were replaced like worn gloves, quickly, often cruelly. And here's your historical fact. Some courts had formal etiquette guides for how to interact with a royal mistress, complete with seating orders, how to address her, and how not to mention her presence in front of the Queen. In France, under Louis XV, these rules were so well known that mistresses had their own salons within Versailles, one room over from ministers and generals. If you were in the mistresses' circle, you had access to real power. But if you didn't know the rules, you were out faster than you could say lace-trimmed disgrace. Rule 3, you don't threaten the Queen, ever. No matter how much the king favours you, the Queen is untouchable, publicly at least. A mistress who embarrassed the Queen, openly competed with her, or tried to claim her status could find herself exiled, discredited, or mysteriously ill by morning. Even the most powerful women like Madame de Montespan walked this razor's edge. She was adored by a Louis XIV, but once the poison scandal cracked the surface of her immaculate image, she was dropped and replaced by the quieter, more devout Maintenon. Just like that. And here's your fringe fact. Royal mistresses were sometimes paid exit pensions when their services were no longer required. Think of it as severance pay for affection. These pensions came with land, jewels, sometimes entire estates, all in exchange for never speaking publicly again. It was hush money disguised as gratitude, And most mistresses took it gladly. Better to retire to a chateau than fight a queen and lose everything. But for all the whispered rules, some things just couldn't be planned. Like timing, like childbirth, like jealousy. The reality is that a royal mistress's power had an expiration date the moment it began. Age, illness, a shifting alliance, or just plain boredom could knock her off the throne of the king's heart. And while some women pivoted into marriage, into religious life, into quiet retirement, others didn't. Some ended in scandal, poverty, even death. The same court that toasted them with champagne would, within weeks, laugh at their downfall. Public love was always conditional, always temporary. And here's the ongoing scholarly debate. Did the courtesan's code empower women, or entrap them in a system designed to chew them up? On one hand, it gave women unprecedented access to power in worlds where they couldn't vote, rule, or hold office. On the other hand, it forced them to perform perfection under pressure, rewarded silence over self-expression, and offered no long-term security. They were queens of nothing, but still expected to reign. Some historians argue that this code was a form of proto-feminism, a workaround, a way to seize power without permission. Others say it was just another cage, this time lined with silk and pearls, and honestly, both sides are probably right. The court was never a place for simplicity, not in politics, not in love. So tonight, picture a royal mistress in her private chambers slipping a sealed letter into the fire. She doesn't flinch as the flames rise. She's survived 5 years in the king's favour, an eternity. Outside, courtiers whisper. A new girl is arriving tomorrow. Young, beautiful, untried. She smiles. She adjusts her earrings. She's already packed her bags. Because if there's one rule no one writes down, it's this. You always leave before you're asked to. Next, we look at the ultimate power of these women. Not just what they did in private, but how they rewrote the public story of monarchy, shaping politics and perception from behind a velvet curtain. Tonight, we finally pull the curtain back on what royal mistresses really did best. And no, it wasn't just what happened between silk sheets and behind velvet doors. The truth is far more interesting, far more dangerous, and far more lasting. Because while kings wore crowns and gave speeches, it was often the women they loved, unofficial, unacknowledged, and uninvited, who moved the real levers of history. Tonight, you're not peeking into a boudoir, you're walking into a shadowy strategy room where love was political currency and mistresses didn't just soothe kings, they shaped kingdoms. We're talking about the political mistress, the woman who didn't just occupy the royal heart but the royal agenda, the woman who quietly orchestrated wars, appointments, trade policies and cultural renaissances from the wrong side of the throne. You've already met several of them, scattered through earlier chapters like glamorous landmines, Pompadour, Maintenon, Montespan, de Kérouaille. But now we look at how their influence stacked up not as scandals, but as policy. Let's start with Madame de Pompadour, the undisputed high priestess of the political mistress model. She wasn't born noble. She wasn't even aristocratic, but Louis XV handed her the keys to Versailles, and she turned the French court into a cultural powerhouse. Art, architecture, philosophy, fashion, she curated it all. She helped fund Enlightenment thinkers, personally oversaw the construction of the Petit Trianon, and had a hand in managing France's foreign alliances. Her fingerprints are all over 18th century French policy, from military blunders to intellectual booms. And here's your historical fact. Pompadour attended state council meetings, something no previous mistress had done openly. Her involvement in governance wasn't a rumour. It was routine. She was a diplomat, a patron, a manager of royal moods and ministers alike. Even when their romantic relationship cooled, Louis kept her close because she was better at court politics than half the men he employed. Then there's Madame de Maintenon, whose rise was subtler but equally potent. As Louis XIV's likely secret wife, she became a kind of royal conscience, pushing him toward more conservative Catholic policies. Historians believe she played a key role in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, one of the most disastrous religious moves in French history. It drove Protestant Huguenots out of France, tanking the economy and spurring unrest. That wasn't a random policy. That was a decision whispered in candle-lit rooms between a king and that woman who'd become his spiritual advisor. And here's your fringe fact. Some royal mistresses were used as spy assets, planted or encouraged by foreign powers to seduce monarchs and leak intelligence. Louise de Kérouaille was long suspected of being a French agent embedded in Charles II's court. She maintained a tight correspondence with Louis XIV, received payments from the French crown, and was so unpopular in Protestant England that her presence practically sparked riots. Whether she actually transmitted state secrets remains a mystery, but her influence confirmed. These women weren't exceptions, they were part of a pattern. The closer you got to the king's heart, the more access you had to his head. Ministers knew it, ambassadors knew it, even queens knew it, which is why so many courts treated mistresses not just as romantic distractions, but as political obstacles or assets. They were watched, wooed, bribed, in some cases assassinated. Because if you controlled the mistress, you controlled the kings. And here's where the scholarly debate gets juicy. Did political mistresses usurp the natural order of governance, or did they compensate for its failings? Supporters argue that kings, often isolated, manipulated, or outright bored, needed someone outside the rigid hierarchy to give them perspective. And mistresses, being unattached to court factions or rigid tradition, could offer honest counsel. Critics argued that the exact opposite, that royal mistresses introduced dangerous emotional volatility into the political process, rewarding favourites and punishing enemies based on nothing more than pillow talk and perfume. The truth, of course, is that both happened. Sometimes the mistress was stabilising, sometimes she was destabilising, sometimes she pushed reforms, sometimes she whispered for war, but one thing's certain, she was always heard. Take Catherine the Great again, because yes, she deserves another mention. Her so-called favourites weren't just eye candy, they were part of a rotating cabinet. Potemkin helped manage her military campaigns. Others served as diplomats, interior ministers, even court architects. Her lovers didn't just touch her body, they helped build her empire. Even in Britain, where mistresses were less formally empowered, women like Alice Keppel served as informal advisors. She passed messages, managed crises, and kept Edward VII from doing something too catastrophic. The British press politely looked away, but inside the palace, everyone knew she was part of the machinery. Here's a quieter example. Harriet Spencer, Duchess of Devonshire's sister, had a close relationship with King George IV, possibly physical, definitely emotional. She helped broker political alliances behind the scenes, working with her husband's contacts and her royal influence to create the Whig political victories of the early 1800s, the idea that royal lovers just lounged around nibbling sugared almonds. Pure fiction. Of course, the danger of the political mistress was always resentment. Queens hated them, ministers distrusted them, populaces grew angry, especially when wars failed or taxes rose and someone remembered the mistress's last diamond necklace. Being powerful didn't mean being safe, and many mistresses, no matter how clever, learned that the hard way. So tonight, picture a woman sitting across from a king, a wine glass in one hand, a map of Europe on the table. She's not making small talk, she's quoting letters from a general, advising restraint, suggesting who to trust and who to exile. She kisses him, sure, but that's not why she's there. She's there because no one else tells him the truth, and if she's careful, if she plays the game right, he just might listen. Next, we explore the beginning of the end. How royal mistresses lost their influence as scandal fatigue set in and monarchies tried to clean up their image for a modern, press-saturated world. Tonight, you watch the long twilight of the royal mistress. The era of secret corridors and diamond-studded hush money is fading. The kings still reign, for now, but the world around them is changing fast. Cameras are everywhere. Parliaments are louder, empires are unravelling, and the people, they're watching more closely than ever. In this new world, the old games don't work quite the same way. The power of the mistress, once a throne-adjacent superpower, is being slowly, almost politely dismantled. And as monarchies scramble to survive the modern age, they begin to do the one thing they've never truly done before. Pretend to behave. It's the 20th century now. The world has endured 2 world wars. Crowns have been knocked off heads from Russia to Romania. Britain has lost its empire. France has lost its kings. Even Spain is on pause. And surviving monarchs are finally understanding something crucial. You can't parade your mistress past 1,000 cameras and expect the public to clap. Discretion stops being a virtue and starts being a requirement. Take King George V, for instance, grandson of Edward VII, inheritor of all the flamboyant chaos. George was not flamboyant. He looked like a banker with an addiction to tweed. His reign marked the beginning of the dignified monarch model. Stiff, silent, deeply boring, and deliberately so. The palace press office began to evolve, the royal image was scrubbed clean, and the idea of a king publicly embracing a mistress became almost unthinkable. And that was the point. Monarchy was now a performance of stability, not indulgence. Here's your historical fact. George's wife, Queen Mary, reportedly forbade him from maintaining even platonic female friendships outside their marriage, fearing press speculation. This was a hard pivot from Edward VII, who kept half of London's actresses in his social circle. The message was clear: no more scandal, no more public lovers, no more charming mistresses turned power brokers. And yet, of course, they didn't disappear. They just went underground. Throughout the 20th century, royal families adopted a new rulebook. If there's a mistress, she must never be confirmed. Rumours were fine, necessary even, but confirmation, absolutely not. This is the age of unofficial truths and royal denial. It's a long, elegant game of he's just a close friend of the family, or she's simply assisting with charitable events. The same dynamics exist, the same power plays, but everything is veiled in plausible deniability. Now here's your fringe fact. King Gustav V of Sweden, who ruled from 1907 to 1950, was the subject of whispered scandals involving both male and female companions, but no mistress or lover was ever officially acknowledged during his reign. That silence wasn't proof of chastity, it was part of a strategy. Keep the headlines clean, and no one asks too many questions. By mid-century, the mistress role wasn't just stigmatized, it was being actively erased. Royal marriages had to appear picture-perfect. Kings and queens were now brands, not just rulers, and brands couldn't afford bad press. So mistresses became smaller, less politically involved, less public. The elegant powerhouses of centuries past were replaced with socialites whose names appeared in gossip columns but never in state archives. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was the disappearance of the royal mistress a moral evolution, or just a better PR campaign? Some say monarchs finally cleaned up their act, embracing monogamy and duty like responsible national symbols. Others, less optimistic, argue that the same behaviours persisted, just more carefully managed. After all, isn't it convenient that mistresses vanished just as photography, radio, and TV became household fixtures? The best proof of this shift is the story of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, long before they became husband and wife. For decades, Camilla was branded the other woman, a private figure whose public presence was politely unacknowledged. During Charles's marriage to Princess Diana, Camilla's name was a quiet but omnipresent shadow, uttered in tabloids, never by the palace. When the affair became undeniable, the backlash was volcanic, not because mistresses were new, but because the world had forgotten how to see one. The monarchy had spent a century pretending they didn't exist. Suddenly they did again, and people didn't know whether to be outraged or relieved. You could feel the cultural tension. People wanted realness, but not mess. Tradition, but not hypocrisy, and the idea that a future king could be openly in love with a woman who'd once been his mistress. That wasn't just scandal, it was unprecedented in the modern British monarchy. And yet, look where we are now. Camilla is queen. She stands beside King Charles III, publicly, proudly, no longer in the shadows. It's almost poetic, right? The royal mistress, the role once designed to be discreet, expendable, invisible, finally put on the crown. But for most of the 20th century, that arc was not yet complete. The few women who drifted near royal beds did so knowing the rules had changed. No power, no voice, no policy. A relationship might bring companionship, even affection, but never legitimacy. It was back to being what it had been before the Louises and the Lolas. A whispered truth with no place in the official story. Even abroad, in monarchies like those in the Middle East or Asia, the same shift occurred. The public consorts were all that mattered. Mistresses were there, but always off stage. Royal PR became a global enterprise and the narrative had to be clean, noble, family-friendly. So tonight, picture a lavish party in his 60s London. A prince in a tuxedo leans just a little too close to a laughing socialite. Cameras flash, but tomorrow there will be no story, no acknowledgement. Just a polite photo in a newspaper with an anonymous caption, "A friend of the family." She leaves alone, of course, she always does. Next we step into the final chapter, the modern day, where the mistress role isn't just fading, is being rewritten entirely by women who refuse to be silenced and royals who can no longer hide behind palace walls. Tonight, you find yourself in the electric present, the age of phones that never sleep, headlines that multiply by the second, and a royal family whose secrets are now everybody's entertainment. Welcome to the modern monarchy, where the word mistress still exists, but it's evolved, mutated, and splintered into something messier and far less manageable. Here, the velvet drapes are gone. There are no secret staircases. If a royal wants to slip off for a midnight rendezvous, someone with a long-range lens is already in the bushes. The game has changed, and so has the mistress. In the past, a mistress lived in the shadows because she had to. Now, she's just as likely to be lit by 1,000 paparazzi flashes, her name trending worldwide before the coffee's brewed. And sometimes she's not even called a mistress. That word, it's become almost too vintage, too loaded with historical glitter and powdered wigs. In the 21st century, the woman romantically linked to royalty without being his wife might be called a companion, a friend, a rumoured partner, or, if the tabloids are feeling cheeky, a close confidant. But the dynamic remains the same. Love without a crown, power without a title, presence without permission. Here's your historical fact. Prince Albert of Monaco, the son of Grace Kelly, has publicly acknowledged 2 children born out of wedlock with 2 different women, neither of whom he married. One was a flight attendant, the other a Togolese air hostess. Their names made headlines, and after paternity tests confirmed the rumours, Albert provided financial support and limited royal recognition to the children. But the women? No titles, no ceremonies, no thanks for your service. It's the 21st century, and the mistress still doesn't get a seat at the table. What's changed, though, is visibility. In previous centuries, mistresses operated under a court-sanctioned code of silence. Now they write memoirs, they post Instagram stories. They're tracked by the press in real time, and when their relationships implode, it's not exile to a countryside estate. It's interviews, book deals, and primetime specials. The palace no longer controls the narrative. That power, too, has shifted. Let's take the most seismic example of the modern era, Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, again. Because yes, this story loops back on itself like a soap opera with no end. Camilla wasn't just Charles's lover. She was his emotional anchor, his most enduring relationship, and for decades, his most inconvenient truth. During his marriage to Princess Diana, the media painted Camilla as a homewrecker. Diana famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." Camilla was vilified, mocked, chased by photographers through parking garages, and yet she stayed. Here's your fringe fact. In the early 90s, the Camillagate tapes leaked, revealing a deeply personal, intimate phone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded without their consent. The content was scandalous, the invasion of privacy even worse, but instead of breaking her, it hardened her public image. Camilla didn't disappear. She endured, quietly, strategically, and in 2005, she married the future king. The mistress became the wife, and now the queen consort. It was, in many ways, the final transformation of the role. No longer something hidden or shameful, Camilla's trajectory forced the public to confront the idea that love doesn't always arrive in the proper order. She didn't erase Diana's legacy. She didn't pretend the past didn't happen. She simply waited it out. Time, after all, is the mistress's best friend. But not all stories end with a crown. In recent years, new rumours and revelations have shaken the walls of Buckingham Palace. From whispers around Prince Andrew's associations with Jeffrey Epstein, to the ongoing public fallout between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and the rest of the royal family, one truth is clearer than ever. The modern royal world no longer protects its secrets. If there are mistresses, lovers, side relationships, they're no longer discussed in whispered codes. They're exposed, debated, dissected online in minutes. And here comes the scholarly debate. Has the mistress role truly evolved, or has it just gone digital? Some argue that the power once wielded in private is now dispersed across public platforms. The mistress can post her own story, control her own brand, refuse the quiet erasure of the past. Others say that while the tools have changed, the core dynamic remains, unofficial, unprotected, uninvited. The royal machine still prefers its scandals to be temporary, its lovers to be silent, and its public image to be immaculate. But silence isn't the default anymore. Women who were once written out of history are now writing themselves back in. Former mistresses go on talk shows, their children sue for inheritance, their relationships are debated by historians, bloggers, and people with anonymous usernames and way too much time. It's messy. It's human, and it's finally honest. So tonight, picture a woman, smart, poised somewhere between scandal and sympathy, sitting in front of a camera. Maybe she's a former lover of a prince, maybe she's the daughter of one, maybe she's none of that, and only rumoured to be. But her voice is steady, her message is clear, she's not disappearing, she's not hiding. And if the palace doesn't acknowledge her, fine, the internet already has. Next, we arrive at the final chapter. Not a scandal, not a fall from grace, but a soft landing, a look at how the legacy of royal mistresses shaped the world and how the echoes of their influence still ripple through every gilded hall where love and power collide. Tonight, we bring it all home, not with a bang, but with a knowing smile and the soft rustle of silk across centuries. You've met the powerhouses, the tacticians, the heartbreakers, the survivors. You've slipped into Versailles, stumbled through Victorian fog, peeked into Windsor's back rooms and squinted at palace press releases trying to decode who a close personal friend of the royal family really is. But now the curtain falls not on scandal, but on legacy. Because the royal mistress, for all her opulence and controversy, shaped history just as much as the monarch she loved. And her fingerprints are still everywhere, you just have to know where to look. First, let's acknowledge the obvious. None of these women ever sat on a throne. They didn't wear crowns, their names weren't engraved on currency, their portraits didn't hang in state galleries, well, not officially. But when you trace the decisions that forged empires, toppled governments, redrew borders, or birthed rebellions, you'll find, more often than not, a woman in the room who was not supposed to be there. A mistress, a companion, a lover with impeccable timing and more influence than any court official would ever publicly admit. Take Madame de Pompadour's patronage of Enlightenment thinkers, which directly fed into the intellectual climate that eventually exploded in revolution. Or Nell Gwyn's popularity with the common people, helping to humanise Charles II after years of Puritan rule. Or even the way Wallis Simpson's romance with Edward VIII forced the British monarchy into a constitutional reshuffle that paved the way for Queen Elizabeth II's unexpected rise. These women weren't footnotes, they were plot twists. Here's your historical fact. The French phrase la maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, was once a recognised court position, complete with housing, income and staff. It wasn't hidden. It was baked into the system, acknowledged, accepted and politically potent. And while modern monarchies no longer include mistress on the organisational chart, the echoes of that institutional memory linger. In diplomacy, in royal image management, in the way certain relationships are handled, with eerie silence or overblown denials. It's not the title that matters, it's the role. And that role, though officially extinct, has never fully died. But here's the quiet truth beneath all of it. Most royal mistresses never intended to be symbols. They were navigating their own lives, sometimes cleverly, sometimes recklessly, inside a system that rarely offered women real power unless they reached for it through proximity. The bedchamber, the drawing room, the letter slipped under a door. These were their courtrooms, their councils, their battlefields. And whether they were manipulating kings or simply trying to survive them, they left behind legacies shaped not by policy, but by presence. Now for your fringe fact. There is an unofficial tourist map in Paris that follows the residences of royal mistresses. It starts at Versailles and winds through the city, from hidden apartments to private salons, showing how embedded these women were in the cultural and political life of the capital. It's not a scandal tour, it's a tribute, an accidental museum of influence. And here's the final scholarly debate. Do we owe royal mistresses a seat in the historical narrative, or do we preserve the sanitized fairy tale of queens, kings, and carefully arranged marriages? You already know where this script lands. History is messier and far more interesting when you include the women who worked outside the frame, the ones who weren't born into power but claimed it anyway, quietly, boldly, or accidentally. The legacy of royal mistresses isn't about who they loved. It's about what they changed. They taught us that intimacy is political, that proximity can be power, that the margins of history are often where the real story lives, and that just because a woman wasn't allowed to wear the crown doesn't mean she didn't hold it, however briefly, in the privacy of candlelight and whispers. So tonight, picture the ghosts of these women walking through the halls of history, not as shameful secrets, but as silent architects. One adjusts her wig and fans herself as she strolls past a treaty she helped shape. Another glances at a painting of the man she loved, still ruling from his frame. A third pauses to straighten the sash on a child who bears a striking resemblance to a king. They smile, they fade. But they never really leave, because once you know to look for them, royal mistresses are everywhere. In the laws that changed, the dynasties that shifted, the rumours that won't die, the quiet places in history where real power was always whispered, never shouted, and now, as the lights dim and your eyes grow heavy, you've walked alongside them, heard their stories, seen their rise, fall, and strange kind of immortality. Not queens. Not quite commoners. Something else entirely, something harder to name but impossible to forget. And now, as you lay back, the journey complete, let it all settle in. The candlelight, the intrigue, the diamonds passed quietly from hand to hand. You've wandered through centuries of whispered names and half-erased lovers, through scandals that made kingdoms tremble, and affairs that stitched the very seams of royal history. Strange, isn't it? How many of the world's biggest events happen not in war rooms, but in bedrooms? Not by generals, but by women in silk slippers, holding kings by the wrist and whispering just enough to change everything. But tonight, no more courts, no more titles, just silence. The women we've followed, some with powdered wigs, some with press secretaries, weren't just lovers, they were mirrors. They reflected what kings desired, what societies feared, what power was willing to give, and what it would never give up without a fight. They were warning signs, consolations, sometimes salvation, sometimes destruction. And somehow, in all that, they were also just women, navigating love and ambition in a world that expected them to disappear the moment the king stopped calling. But they didn't disappear, did they? You saw how their stories crept back in archived letters, in royal bloodlines, in the awkward pauses during palace interviews, in the way modern royals now marry for love, because once upon a time the ones they loved weren't allowed to stay. So as the night settles around you like the heavy curtains of a drawing room long abandoned, take one last slow breath. Let the drama fade. Let the lace and gold dissolve into the dark. History's queens ruled by blood, mistresses ruled by nerve, and the smart ones, they outlasted them all. Sleep well, dream of candlelight and quiet rebellions.